Chapter 586. At this moment, with the strange changes in the central tower, even the ground under their feet was shaking violently and falling apart. Amidst the violent tremors, the land bulged and floated in the air. They collided with each other and began to rise under the gravity of the tower. Countless bridges extended from the top of the tower as if they were growing, connecting the massive buildings and plots of land that came from all directions. The long warm-up had begun. Not long after, the eternal frost core would reveal its true appearance. In a moment of shock, Huaishur and Ogiest quickly retreated and reorganized their formation, trying to prevent their side from being separated in this violent turbulence. But then they found that the ground they were on seemed to be being pulled to the tower. What was going on? Taking the elevator? Or directly? But just by looking at the invisible gravitational force emitted by the crown on the dome giant's head and the lightning guide rope that fell from the sky of the underworld, they knew that this situation was not accidental. The people from both sides, scattered everywhere, were being continuously thrown into the central tower by the miraculous carvings above their heads in order to gain the upper hand. When they noticed this situation, the members of the Iron Crystal Constellation and the Ivory Tower looked at each other with unfriendly gazes. Although, according to the technical ability of both sides, as long as they did not die on the spot, they could always be pulled back. But people could make mistakes, just like horses could stumble. In an emergency situation, the emergency rune that could instantly freeze the vital organs would also fail, let alone the large group of people who were used as tools by both sides. The battle that stopped abruptly broke out again at this moment. Just before the two armies, Huaishur's movements suddenly stopped. As if hit by something invisible, he flew into the air and landed awkwardly. He flew into the air inexplicably and fell into the dust inexplicably. It was hard to understand. It was as if he was shot by a sniper rifle. After a brief numbness on his back, there was a sharp pain. Something penetrated Huaishur's lungs. But when he looked down at his chest in a daze, he could not see the wound. There was not even blood. Dizziness came suddenly. Huaishur's vision suddenly turned black. In the distance, under the thick clouds, an aircraft seemed to be nailed to the air, hovering precisely in the storm. No matter how the torrential rain and bloody wind blew, he did not waver in the slightest. The gun, which was more than 2 meters long, was still aimed straight at Huaishur's position. The colonel was crouching in the cabin. Through the scope, he could not see the scene clearly. Relying on IV's superb material science foundation and extreme shooting ability, he created an experimental product and completed a super long-range sniper attack of 26 kilometers. The error did not exceed 10 centimeters. It was perfect. The troop member beside the colonel, the doctor, was half kneeling on the ground, holding a complicated telescope in his hand and constantly adjusting the parameters. When he clearly saw the figure lying on the ground in a sorry state, he was immediately overjoyed. It hit. Can you really hit him? The colonel was in disbelief. As expected, we've been misled all along. The professor smiled and said, he has some kind of instinctive intuition towards death. It's so sensitive that he can detect anything that can hurt him, regardless of whether it's a killing intent or not. I've seen such a record in the history of the Ivy League, but it's not impossible to verify. The doctor said, no matter how keen his intuition is, as long as it can't kill him or even make him bleed or hurt, it won't be within his sensing range. This was the gift they had prepared for Huaishur's death premonition, the gift that the Ivy League had prepared. Can it really work? The colonel was skeptical. It was originally prepared for the two old guys, Simon and Forster. It's not a bad thing to use it on him, the doctor explained. Have you heard of the faceless man's antidote? The colonel pondered for a long time before he reacted. I always thought it was just a legend. Yes, the doctor sighed. I thought so too before I saw it. Antidote. The alchemy potion that had once appeared in the markets of the border and hell was not so much a poison or a curse, but an unfinished blessing. It was originally created for the sublimator who had chosen the wrong path during the advancement. It could allow a person's stigmata to roll back to the previous stage without any repercussions, just like the legendary white wolf hook of the Middle East, the American solar calendar, the Russian Federation's cross of repentance, and other authoritative relics. Unfortunately, for some reason that even the creator himself did not understand, when the reversal began, the original stigmata did not disappear. Instead, it entered a virtual state that even the sublimata himself could not detect. Once the effect of the potion was over for half an hour, it would quickly return to its original state. The defects and pain that should have existed could not be avoided. During this process, no matter what was done, there would be no effect, and no change would be of any help. After all, it was an unfinished product. But soon, someone found other uses for it. For example, assassination and poisoning. It was rumored that the creator of the antidote disappeared because of this. Until today, no one had found his trace, and no one had found the complete formula of the antidote. It could not be reproduced. At the same time, it also meant that its effect was incurable. Sometimes, even without the need to make a move, the effect of the reversal was enough to cause serious damage to the sublimator. Just like now, in the midst of the chaos, Huaishur staggered and fell to the ground, bending over in pain. He pulled off the small respirator hanging on his face and opened his mouth, but he could not breathe. He felt that his stigmata was rapidly shrinking. The sacred burial ground around him began to rapidly fade, but the source substance was scattered and began to riot. His brain was buzzing. It was difficult to control. The reversal began. Stigmata, young master of life, dissipated. What the hell? On the ruins of another plot of land, Raymond looked at the scene displayed on the screen from the truck, dumbfounded. Huaishur was sniped. But where was the sniper? No matter how he scanned and observed with his radar, he could not find the sniper's position. It was not until the search range was expanded to the maximum that he could distinguish the signal of a Griffin aircraft from the countless noises. The distance was 31 kilometers. Raymond did not hesitate and waved his hand. Under the cracked armor of the truck, the heavy cannon suddenly rose, adjusted the angle, corrected the coordinates, and locked onto the aircraft far away in the sky. The furnace of the chariot of fate began to operate urgently. Overdrive, a blazing light brewed in the cannon, about to launch a retaliatory counterattack. But before that, the ear-piercing threat alarm had already exploded in Raymond's ears. Instinctively, he turned the cannon and aimed behind him. Fire! A mighty stream of light gushed out, engulfing the figure that walked out of the ruins. Then, the heat that was enough to burn an entire building was split in half in front of an overly large heavy sword with a shield. The blood-colored shadow of Azura rose into the air, immersed in blood and death. Not Heaven raised his eyes and smashed the Vajra in his hand forward. In that instant, the cannon was actually split into two in the middle of the slash. When the cannon made of pure heat slowly dissipated, the dull sound of lava flowing could be heard. On the ground that had been burned red, an armored figure slowly walked towards Raymond. Raymond was already frozen on the spot. He could not move as he was stared at by that pair of old eyes. "Hey, isn't this too much?" He swallowed his saliva dryly. "Didn't you say that Tier 4 can't participate in the war?" "The contract, that's right." The captain of the Eye of Nightmare, Silent Avery, raised his hand and took off his ferocious lion helmet, revealing his cold face. "I didn't participate in the struggle between the Ivy League and the Ivory Tower." He calmly told the man in front of him, "I came here only to purge the traitors under my sect and wash away the shame. Raymond did not say anything. His fingers that were hanging by his waist twitched as if he was trying to hold something tightly, but he grabbed nothing. He was slightly stunned for a moment, and his expression gradually became bitter. AI fully stared at his waist and asked indifferently, "Why?" "Leonard, where's your sword?" "It's broken a long time ago, teacher." Raymond sighed and slowly raised his hands. "Can I surrender? I can kneel down now, as long as you can keep me alive, even if I have to break my own hands and feet. As for money, we can discuss any amount. I've saved up a sum of money over the years, and it's not a small amount, as long as you can open the net." But his voice was interrupted. Avery looked at him. There was no pity or gentleness in his eyes. There was only a cold calmness. "It seems that the bones are broken together with the sword." Raymond was stunned on the spot. After a long time, he lowered his head weakly. "Yes, it's all broken. Why can't you let me go?" He asked, "Why do you have to make things difficult for a knight who doesn't even have a mount? You see, for a disgraceful person like me, even if you don't care about me, there will be a day when I die a horrible death, right? Why do you have to do it yourself?" It's useless to say more. "Draw your weapon, Leonard, son of the Red Dragon." Avery held the end of the heavy sword with both hands and announced indifferently, "Let me see how much you've improved since the battle at the Farbach mansion. How far have you fallen after losing your Red Dragon?" In the dead silence, Raymond sighed. "Is there no other choice?" AI fully nodded in understanding. "Are these your last words?" "No, I'm just—" Raymond opened his mouth to explain. Then, the silent cannon beside him seemed to finally be unable to watch any longer. As a passerby, it spoke up to help Leonard. Unfortunately, it didn't say, "I'm telling you the truth," or "Indeed." What came out of the cannon was a terrifying light that was not inferior to the previous attack. Avery sighed. He wasn't stunned, wasn't shocked, and even couldn't help but want to laugh. He raised the blade in his hand and slashed down again. He easily tore apart the cannon attack in front of him, but Raymond's figure could no longer be seen on the spot. The ruins were a mess. The truck and Raymond had disappeared without a trace. In the distance, they could see a truck that had changed beyond recognition. It was like a spider that had grown 8 legs and was carrying Raymond as it sped away. The speed was unbelievably fast. Ran away. It was an expected result. Avery didn't chase after him. Instead, he sat on a rock, supported himself with his sword, and began to take a short break. "Run, Leonard. Before fate comes. How far can you run?" He murmured softly as he stared at the resolute face reflected on the sword's spine. "This is the last bit of benevolence your teacher has for you." At this moment, on the countless pieces of land floating in the air, on the huge platform of one of the dozens of battlefields that were constantly splitting and merging as Weisher fell to the ground, everyone present on both sides noticed his abnormality. The billowing darkness of the bone-burying sanctuary quickly dissipated, and the burning flag disappeared without a trace. The figure that fell to the ground was revealed. He tried to support his body with difficulty, but then the face quickly disintegrated. Countless dark green colors emerged from the blood vessels and quickly spread, covering his entire body in an instant. He looked at his hands in disbelief. "This is teacher." Yuan widened her eyes and wanted to rush over. However, Weisher raised his hand with all his might and shouted at her in panic, "Don't come over. I want to." As soon as he finished speaking, a terrifying explosion burst out from Weisher's body. The turbulent dust and airwaves swept through, engulfing the thin figure and spreading in all directions. Not only did the Eye of Nightmare, who wanted to snatch the head, but even Yuan and the other members of the exploration team were sent flying backward, unable to get close. Countless dark green things that looked like blood splashed out. Amidst the violent explosion, only a broken sword blade flew out. It stabbed into the ground diagonally. It made a low sound. What the hell? On the aircraft, in the distance, the colonel and the doctor also looked at the scene through the telescope in shock, unable to accept it. Even the two of them did not expect such an outcome. What kind of hidden dangers did that guy plant when he leveled up? Now that the reversal medicine had taken effect, the source substance had immediately lost control and self-destructed. Soon, countless crackling sounds tore through the lingering sound of the explosion and spread out from the scattered dust. In the center of the explosion, a staggering figure walked out with difficulty. However, as he walked, countless thorns, poisonous flowers, and ferocious giant trees broke out of the mud. Those sharp trees crazily stretched out in all directions, spreading, growing, and dying. With a flick of the finger, countless lives and deaths gathered around him, forming a complicated and huge cycle. A sudden gust of wind swept past, sweeping away the dancing dust, revealing Huaishi's face. She was completely at a loss. She had no idea what had just happened. Two intersecting dark green curse marks covered his face, but they did not show any ferociousness or gloominess. Instead, they looked holy and benevolent. He looked at his hands and was puzzled. I advanced again. Chapter 587. Oh my God! What's going on? Huaishi turned pale. With fright the moment he came to his senses. How did I become a traitor? After inexplicably turning back into a mountain ghost, he could no longer control the rampaging origin substance and the vitality in his body that was about to explode. He had advanced again, but the problem was his advancement was the path of the Azure Emperor. At this moment, not only Huaishi, but even the person from Mount Yu Dai and the Mystic Bird, who was reviewing official documents, raised their heads in shock. One of them felt that a towering tree had suddenly appeared in his courtyard, while the other took out the authoritative relic painting scroll and flipped to the part about the third level. He looked at the name on the light and repeatedly confirmed it. He felt that he was starting to get bald. He couldn't figure out what Huaishi was doing. There was suddenly another person in the Dongsha genealogy. Were you surprised? Were you surprised? Suddenly, the old man had the urge to vomit blood. Why didn't you stay in the celestial genealogy? Why did you come to the Dongsha genealogy? In particular, this person's correction value had actually started to rise. The power from the golden amber. Demeter directly moved the endless forest around Canberra and stuffed 1/50,000th of the correction value into Huaishi's body. In other words, according to the judgment of the heavens, Huaishi had at least 1/50,000th of the contribution in the fertilization of the entire Australian soil. Even if it wasn't much, as a sacred mark of the Azure Emperor, as long as he participated, he could obtain terrifying growth. He directly reached the maximum level on the spot, the third level of perfection. Now, Huaishi felt that it was difficult to breathe. This was because when his lungs inhaled and exhaled, what surged was a torrent of life force that was like a tidal wave. The life force extended from his limbs and bones, and had already formed the enormous illusory image of Mount Yu Dai. He could even feel a sense of mockery coming from the border from a distant space. Although he didn't know what was going on, a certain heartless old lady first mocked him here, and then the Mystic Bird said that they would do it together. Little brother, what's wrong with you? I have to say, Huaishi slowly raised his head and sighed at the enemies in front of him. Although I don't know what happened, I feel that this is definitely your fault. As he spoke, poisonous vines, evil grasses, and man-eating flowers rose from the ground beneath his feet one after another. It was full of vitality. However, Huaishi's heart was cold. He pitted himself for risking his life for celestial genealogy. For so many years, he had been loyal to celestial genealogy, but who would have thought that he would fail miserably and be forced to become a traitor? They would rather hide in the dark and shoot in the dark than betray Huaishi. What kind of F***King international traitor spirit does Ivy League have? Fortunately, he could feel that the divine mark in his body was essentially the reflection of the moon in the well, like a flower in the water. As long as he trampled on it a few more times, it would collapse at any time. He still had the possibility of rejoining the team. Otherwise, he would have burst into tears by now. However, Huaishi immediately discovered the advantage of the Dongsha genealogy. After removing the adaptability to hell, at the same time, there was no potential danger of being eroded by the records of hell. In an instant, the sorrowful cries that had been lingering in his ears for the past few days disappeared without a trace. He felt as if he had been reborn, feeling refreshed, especially when Huaishi opened his arms and propped up the huge and complicated network of vitality on his body. The shadow of Mount Udai instantly shrouded the entire land. Endless vitality flourished in the soil that was soaked in blood rain. Even if it was full of poison to humans, it was a heaven-like world for plants that didn't fear death. As the shadow expanded, the main trunk appeared proudly under the entanglement of countless vitality. It reflected its own figure in hell. Even Huaishi was stunned when he raised his head. This was because his divine mark wasn't the hibiscus tree, which was famous for its majesty and glory on the Azure Emperor's path. Instead, it was a tree with no canopy and no forks. It seemed to be connected to the heavens and the earth. It had become the backbone of the network of vitality, supporting the terrifying scale of Mount Udai on its own. This network of vitality had completely manifested. It wasn't the hibiscus tree. It was the creation tree. At this moment, however, it wasn't just here. When the creation tree fully unfurled, it was like a giant pillar that supported the heavens and the earth. It extended upwards, gradually dimming and dissipating, but the top couldn't be seen. It took root downwards, piercing through the soil and connecting to the ground below. However, its roots couldn't be seen. It was like a pillar of green light enveloped Huaishi's body. The other two ends actually pierced deeply into the endless curses of the Twilight Village. The blood rain above, the gray waves below. It began to extract the curses that were everywhere, transforming them into origin substances that spontaneously transformed Huaishi's surroundings. When the creation tree combined with the hundreds of thousands of different types of vitality on Mount Udai, it actually formed a structure that resembled a miniature frame. The projection of Mount Udai into this hell. Even Huaishi was scared out of his wits. He had wanted to try it out, but he hadn't expected the old lady to be so generous as to let him borrow it. She had allowed a traitor like him to borrow the Azure Emperor's power. Even if it was just a projection, to do as he pleased, there was a feeling of being overwhelmed by the favor. Am I really that popular? I should go back and apologize to her. In the blink of an eye, such a shocking transformation had already befallen Huaishi. In the blink of an eye, the old hen had turned into a cruiser. The young arbiter of life, whose divine mark had been retreating, suddenly transformed and leveled up again. Not only that, but she had also borrowed a set of divine equipment. When Huaishi raised his eyes and stared at the formation in front of him, as well as the rain of javelins thrown by the minotaurs, he revealed a joyful smile. This was interesting. Casually, Huaishi pulled out the sword of virtue from the ground beside him and pointed it forward. In an instant, countless trees stood side by side, extracting the vitality of the decay in the blood rain. They grew crazily and turned into a row of high walls covering the front of Huaisher. Accompanied by violent tremors, the ferocious and twisted wooden walls kept making cracking sounds. Soon, they withered rapidly in the blink of an eye and fell back into the mud with the javelins all over their bodies. They grew too quickly and withered too quickly. It was difficult for pure matter to grow in an instant, and it was destined not to last. Since that was the case, he would change his method. He raised his hand. In front of hundreds of eyes of nightmare, Huaisher snapped his fingers. In an instant, the builder tree shook, and in the projection of the huge mountain range's vitality, countless green lights descended from the sky and landed on every Snake Man undead army. In an instant, a circle of faintly discernible sharp thorns formed around their bodies. Super wide-area thorny halo. With such a terrifying scale, not only were the enemies stunned, even the elders were stunned on the spot. They were shocked by the sudden blessing and almost couldn't hold their swords and sabers. In just a snap of his fingers, Huaisher's origin form was depleted, but in the blink of an eye, it was replenished by the origin form absorbed from the disasters and curses. Is this the pleasure of a nanny? I love it. Huaisher smiled and snapped his fingers for the second time. The green light descended from the sky again and entered the bodies and mounts of every undead army, quickly transforming into pure vitality, healing their wounds, replenishing their blood, and dispelling all scars. Huaisher felt as if he had transformed into a human-shaped war and peace, with endless halos and blessings for him to squander. When he snapped his fingers for the third time, all the undead army shrouded in the vitality network suddenly expanded, and dark green light shot out from their eyes. After Huaisher adjusted the type of vitality network to the most suitable environment for the undead army, it was as if this Snake Man settlement had returned to the sacred forest that only appeared in the legends of their ancestors. Endless vitality poured into their bodies as if it was free of charge. They could not wait to roar and gallop, wanting to shed some blood, whether it was their own or the enemy's. In that instant, the mighty undead army actually collided head-on with the Minotaur's defense line while galloping for the Ring of Eternity. The elder pulled off his cumbersome mask, raised the flag with one hand, and pulled out the spear on his back with the other. He roared for eternal victory. They were clearly light cavalry, but they seemed to be heavy cavalry covered in armor. They chose the cruelest and most violent charging formation. When the dark green torrent collided with the high black wall, a loud, tragic sound reverberated in everyone's ears. Just like a flood breaking through a dam, the earth-shattering tremors suddenly spread. Countless iron shards and blood spread forward like sand. The elder's body was instantly penetrated by two short spears, but his spear was wedged deeply into the Minotaur warrior's face. The huge lizard lifted its legs and stomped on the prey in front of it. The elder had already pulled out the spear on his body and stabbed forward in a frenzy. The wound quickly closed under Huaisher's control and disappeared, leaving only faint traces of wood. What was originally a fatal injury was now a controllable hidden injury. When the frenzied undead army discovered this, they truly became an undead army that did not fear death. The war horn sounded once again. The roar of "For the Ring of Eternity" sounded from the torrent again. Wherever it passed, the defensive formation that the Minotaurs were so proud of actually fell apart like a jar. The tragic song of blood and blood once again played on this piece of land. It was one-sided, pressing forward. Prepare to give the order to retreat. 26 kilometers away, the colonel slowly raised his head from the scope and said to the pale-faced doctor, "Give up on the victory in that area. While the organization is still there, assign them to other areas." The doctor was silent for a moment, then said dryly, "I will take responsibility for this." "It's not your responsibility alone." The colonel sighed. Now it seems that Huaisher's threat level is still higher than expected. maybe Pan DeLong will mobilize the entire troop to deal with him alone. The two looked at each other and did not say anything. The aircraft quickly ascended and disappeared into the clouds. Chapter 588. Perhaps the projection of Mount Tai was too stable, but after more than half an hour, the projection of the Jianmu tree slowly dissipated along with the collapse of the sacred mark. Huaishur couldn't help but want to cry when he experienced the return of young Master Ming and the bone-burying sanctuary. It wasn't because he was moved. It was because it was too uncomfortable. It was as if he was kicked into a gas chamber after getting used to the fresh air. It was difficult to breathe. Celestial genealogy was very sensitive to records, not to mention that Huaishur still had the Book of Destiny. The history left behind in hell would almost instinctively entangle his soul. The intense dizziness was even stronger than before. The moment he recovered, Huaishur staggered, and darkness appeared in front of his eyes. He fell into a nightmarish illusion again. Only one step left. A figure with a pipe in his mouth leaned over, and his blurry face seemed to be smiling. Soon, hell will become heaven. True power will be born in your hands, eternal and undying. He reached out his hand and offered salvation to Huaishur in the quagmire. But when Huaishur clenched his hand, what he felt was not happiness and peace, but indescribable despair. At that moment, he fell into an even deeper abyss. Countless twisted limbs entangled his body, pulling him down into an even darker place. Please save me. A hoarse prayer echoed in his ears, and he kept screaming, please, so annoying. In his dizziness, Huaishur roared and slashed down with his axe. You've all been dead for tens of millions of years, and your ashes are gone. How can I save you? Do you want me to give up my body for you to come back to life? The darkness shattered. At that moment, Huaishur opened his eyes. He tried his best to breathe. Yuan looked at Huaishur's face uneasily. Teacher, are you okay? It's just a nightmare. Huaishur shook his head and subconsciously pressed on the needle hole on his arm. If it wasn't for the great Grandmaster's spiritual substance stabilizer, he might have been dragged deeper into the records, and it would be difficult for him to break free from the past history of this land. It was just like the first time he had used the Book of Destiny. He had almost been trapped in the library of the abyss of hell. Now, Huaishur didn't know if it was because of the increase in height or because of the reactivation of the Twilight Village, but he discovered that the broken records in the air were becoming more and more active. It was as if it was radiating from a huge gravitational source. There was something like a star that was constantly radiating endless pain and despair in all directions. Sunmaker. Huaishur's expression changed as he suddenly noticed this. With the activation of the Dusk Village and the activation of the Eternal Core, the Sunmaker hidden in the depths of hell would definitely awaken once more. He might even recover to his peak state from thousands of years ago, an existence that led a world to its final destruction. If compared to the present natural enemy, this thought made Huaishur's hair stand on end. He looked up at the huge projection of the dome giant and the iron crystal throne floating in the sky. He didn't believe that the Grandmaster hadn't guessed this. But just what did he mean? Just what was this place? Chaotic thoughts constantly emerged in Huaishur's mind. It felt like he was just a little bit away from the final truth, but he couldn't truly touch it. In his countless thoughts, he had brushed past that crucial point countless times, until the final rumble interrupted his thoughts. At that moment, as the rising ground came to an abrupt stop, Huaishur finally arrived at the central tower. And it was also at that moment that the long warm-up finally came to an abrupt end. The Eternal Core, activate. What followed was a tide that filled all the gaps between heaven and earth. It tore at everyone's consciousness and soul, and it was a loud noise that was enough to drag everyone's soul into hell. This was a sorrowful cry that filled all of hell. What the hell is this? Huaisha looked up in a daze, his vision turning dark. He staggered forward, wanting to take a closer look. However, at this moment, countless pitch-black mud appeared between the countless complicated machines and massive structures on the tall tower that had suddenly opened up. From the cracks, from the sealed cabin, from every corner. This was a strange substance that Huaisha had seen before. A liquid as viscous as pitch surged in every nook and cranny. Deformed objects that looked like limbs popped out from it endlessly, like the spasming of a dying person trying to grab anything within reach. In vain, they sought expectations that didn't exist. Sunmaker, please be merciful. Countless distorted faces overlapped each other, constantly emerging from within, as the perpetual motion core operated. They screamed, hoarsely, emitting tragic cries. Don't go, don't leave, don't give up. Please save me, please. Bestow salvation. At that moment, Huaisha froze in place, frozen by the sorrowful cries that assaulted his face. The pain was like a tidal wave, with no end in sight, turning into a monstrous frenzy. In the darkness, countless broken records turned into the hell and abyss from thousands of years ago, engulfing him. It was like a bystander walking between the curtains of a play. In an instant, he saw the decay of all things, the arrival of the end, the extinguishment of the sun and the moon, and the drying up of the earth. He saw how the huge world sank into hell bit by bit. He also saw how everything that was beyond recognition was rebuilt by them. In order to save the world, they rebuilt heaven and earth. In order to return to paradise, they rebuilt all things. Trees made of iron, birds made of bronze, beasts made of steel, and even stars made of silver. In the end, the power of eternity descended on this paradise, and the hell of despair followed. From the moment the sun, that represented salvation, rose, the changes that the sunmakers had never imagined enveloped the entire hell. The happy smiles on their faces gradually stiffened, and then they quickly cracked and fell apart. Under the illumination of the eternal sun, the eternal life finally ushered in the final transformation. After the broken body like porcelain, what flowed out was viscous sludge like asphalt. Then, one by one, they involuntarily flew to the tower like components and integrated into the core of eternal frost. They cried out in indescribable pain, but there was no relief. In endless despair, they yearned for an end, but the end would not come. The sunmakers finally understood what had happened, but everything was already irreversible. Their eternal life had begun. As Huaisha walked through this hell in a daze, she was surrounded by countless sharp screeches and shrieks. When had this hell ever been born because of failure? He finally understood how the so-called perpetual motion machine was created. What kind of method was used to achieve the endless and eternal power? Recasting heaven and earth, the sun, the moon, and all things, rebuilding the world, the eternal machine, and the eternal power that maintained the foundation of all worlds, the core of eternal frost. They had indeed done it. They had not failed. They were all still alive, all of them, in this hell that they had created with their own hands. The so-called machine of immortality and the furnace of eternal frost were the same thing, and the power source of the furnace of eternal frost was all the people in this hell who had used the machine of eternal life in order to survive. They had all been assimilated by hell and turned into something that was neither human nor ghost, hanging in the furnace's core. It was like an inexhaustible battery. In the endless pain, endless despair was produced, turning into an inexhaustible source of energy and power for the workshop masters of hell. There was no relief. Thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, in the endless and eternal time, they cried out in sorrow. until they reached the end of destruction, the deepest part of the abyss. Now, Huaisher finally understood where everything she saw in the illusion came from, and who was the one who had witnessed the destruction in front of her. Sunmaker, the honorable Supreme One. Countless wriggling and distorted crazy faces emerged from the sludge, staring at Huaisher. No, staring at the former Sunmaker, calling in vain. Please, please have mercy. This time, Huaisher finally heard their words clearly. Please, save us. Countless wails sounded again. They called out in pain, longed, and hoped that the last hero would bring them a miracle. It contained their last hope and humble prayers. Please kill us. This was their last wish. But even so, it was already a luxurious dream that could not be realized. They had used all methods and tried all possibilities until even the other kingmakers lost the power to resist and gradually turned into sludge. There was no longer any hope for this land to survive. Only the Sunmaker was left to wander around this empty hell in a daze. Don't be afraid. I will save you. I can definitely save you. Definitely. He repeated over and over again, murmuring in a hollow voice. So, please wait for me. This was the desperate wail of the last survivor in the endless eternity. Please don't abandon me. He didn't know how much time had passed or what else he had experienced. Too many records filled Huaisher's soul: the fall of the Twilight Village, the forging of the eternal frozen furnace core, the descent of the Hell Workshop Masters, and the failure of countless resistance. Too much history and too much pain were carried in the Sunmaker's records and engraved in this hell. Just watching from the sidelines would be infected by the endless despair. Huaisher felt himself falling faster and faster and began to dissolve. He had already entered too deep. Just like before, he was attracted by the gravity of hell and began to assimilate step by step, until a cracked palm grabbed his shoulder and pulled him up, causing the assimilation of hell to come to an abrupt end. Then, with the last of his strength, he pushed upwards. He wanted to leave this endless nightmare. Chandra? At the last moment, Huaisher saw a familiar uniform and a face that had been transformed by a machine, and the lips that opened and closed with difficulty. He bid farewell to the world silently, with a smile. Chapter 589. In the dust of despair, Huaisher opened his eyes. As if he didn't hear the shouts of Yuan Yuan and Lin Shurgio beside him, he propped himself up and looked up at the tower in front of him. It was the final masterpiece of the Makers and the cage of suffering that had imprisoned them for thousands of years. This was the eternal frost furnace. It was a creation of despair formed by countless sufferings, the essence of disaster in hell. As long as it woke up, there would be endless wails. As long as it operated, the entire hell would be driven by it. Eternal dusk. In comparison, the curse of day and night here was just the radiation leaked by the furnace. In order to resist hell, they chose to struggle desperately. Under the guidance and temptation of the Purgatory Workshop Master, the Makers walked step by step into the desperate situation called eternity. They became more and more desperate and crazy. Perhaps the moment they refused a peaceful death and chose to make a deal with the devil, they were destined to fall into a situation more tragic than death. But was all of this brought on by themselves? Huaisher was silent and didn't speak. It was a critical time now. Even if the tower was in front of him, even if the situation was good, he sat on the ground, raised his head without saying a word, and stared at the sky. In the silence, everyone was quietly waiting for his order. But the order didn't come. Sir Huaisher, after a long silence, the elder finally said, "The opportunity can't be missed." "I know," Huaisher said. "I'm just thinking." Then he didn't say anything else, and no one disturbed Huaisher's thinking. In this way, amidst the thunder and loud noises in the distance, Huaisher quietly stared at the blood rain, the febrile wind, and the gray tide in the sky. This world was full of disaster and despair. Finally, he spoke. "Great Master, can you hear me? I'm here." A voice with a metallic texture sounded in the air, as calm as ever. No, it should be said that it was indifferent. He said, "You have a question to ask me, right?" Huaisher didn't speak. He just waited in silence. "I know what you want to ask, Huaisher," the Great Master said. The Great Grandmaster said, "You want to ask, have I known all along? Did I know it from the start? Do I have any special arrangements? Do I have a solution? Just like the blue-skinned robots in the comics. Omnipotent, always able to find a tool to solve the problem. And can I save them, right?" Huaisher lowered his eyes and sighed silently. Even if you knew in your heart that all of this was irreversible thousands of years ago, when they persisted in seeking salvation from hell, the outcome was already decided. Just like the celestial genealogy in the past, she thought she could soar, but in fact, she only fell into the deeper darkness. Even if Kondra's example is right in front of us, after a short pause, the Great Grandmaster asked again, "Even so, do you still have expectations for me?" "That's right." Huaisher nodded slowly and finally made a sound. "You should have known the answer long ago, right?" "Yes," he said. "Then, tell me, you need my answer?" The Great Grandmaster said coldly, "I can give you an order. You don't need to think about anything, and you don't need to hesitate. You just need to do it. All the responsibilities are not on you. But Huaisher, do you really need someone else to give you an order and help you make a decision?" In silence, Huaisher lowered his head and stared at the long sword on his knee. On the quiet blade, his eyes were reflected. They were extremely calm, without any fluctuations. He suddenly asked, "Will you oppose me, Great Grandmaster? What if I will?" The Great Grandmaster's tone was still without any fluctuations. Huaisher did not answer. He just held the handle of the blade, but the irreconcilable answer had been given by his eyes reflected on the ridge of the sword. That kind of eyes, in silence. The Great Grandmaster on the iron crystal seat suddenly laughed softly. It was full of mockery and sarcasm. At this moment, he finally felt that this was the successor that Luo So had chosen. That old bastard did not lie to him. What he saw now was more anger, compassion, and decisiveness than when he was young, and more importantly, cruelty. "No one will praise you. Why, sure. No one will express their blessings and gratitude," he said. "No matter how much you do, you will not be able to bring salvation to this land. At best, it will just be a late end." "I know. What you bring is not salvation." Huaisher nodded. "I know. Very good." The Great Grandmaster finally raised his eyes and told him, "You are the highest person in charge of the iron crystal seat. Huaisher, even if only for this moment. Now, since you have made a decision, your time has come. No one should be able to stop you. As long as you live in the world, mistakes are inevitable. If you want to try, I will not stop you." He playfully quoted the dialogue between God and the devil in Faust, allowing Huaisher to act willfully. "I understand." Huaisher slowly stood up, propped up his sword, and finally said, "Thank you, Mr. Mikhail." The Great Grandmaster did not say anything else. He had already left the ground. On the bridge of the iron crystal seat, the metal giant with his arms crossed retracted his gaze and turned to look at the projection behind him. "See, Russell," he said impatiently. "The representative you've chosen has already received my vote. Announce the results of the vote." 4-1, with one abstention. The resolution is passed. In the projection in the conference room, Russell announced the results. "Whether it's him or you, go ahead and do it, Mikhail. I will bear all the consequences." The overlapping of events, the convergence of cause and effect, the time, place, people, and events, All the prerequisites have been met. Let us draw the final curtain. Following Russell's words, all the members in the conference room looked up and guided the descent of heaven. Under the great Grandmaster's control, the huge secret apparatus left behind by the Republic was awakened. The array enveloped, and the framework was established out of thin air. All the engines of the iron crystal seat instantly entered an overloaded state. A huge miracle suddenly appeared and descended on the ship, causing the huge iron crystal seat to be unable to withstand it. It emitted a low rumble from the overclocked operation. The countless records in hell were captured by this huge gravitational force and gathered inwards. A huge amount of source substance poured in, slowly forming the shadow of a thick book. There was no title on the cover, only countless illusory characters flashing and drifting. They began to search for the main axis that pierced through the core from the billions of fragments. The hell alchemy that was once unique to celestial genealogy reappeared. Gather the phenomena and gather the souls. The essence of hell was about to be reborn here. Under the tower, Huaishur stood up. He didn't know if it was because he had finally made up his mind or because he was no longer swayed, but the entangled precipitation of hell could no longer affect him. The wailing was still ear-piercing. However, Huaishur's heart had unexpectedly calmed down, without any ripples. He looked up at the elder, who had been waiting beside him for a long time, and asked, "Is something the matter?" "Yes," the elder said. "Your students have just captured Ogiest." Huaishur was slightly stunned. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Yuan and Lin Shurjiu, but Ogiest's strength was already at the peak of the 3rd level. He had been carefully nurtured by the Ivory Tower since he was young, and his accumulation of experience was astonishing. None of those who could survive in hell for so long were easy to deal with. Even if his 2 students joined forces, they might not be able to do anything to him. To be exact, he stood in place by himself as if he was stupid and didn't move at all, the elder said. He didn't say anything when we asked him, as if he had given up on resisting. "We don't know what to do for a while." "Where is he?" Huaishur said. "Bring him over for me to see." Soon, Ogiest, who was shackled, was escorted by his former colleagues and sent to Huaishur. His expression was still calm, or rather, he was already numb. He was disheartened. Like Huaishur, after understanding the nature of the eternal frost furnace, he could naturally understand what the so-called immortal machine was. What's more, before this, he knew far more than Huaishur, and the impact he felt was even greater. The last glimmer of hope was completely destroyed. Perhaps by using it, there was still a possibility of saving Kandra. But what was the point of that? Would he personally turn his adoptive father into a monster of eternal pain? Everything that happened in the village of Dusk repeated itself. After gambling everything for a glimmer of hope, when the truth was revealed, it ushered in the destruction. After losing the hope of saving Kandra, Ogiest no longer had the motivation to continue acting and rebel. Just by looking at those empty eyes, Huaishur knew what kind of abyss of pain he was wandering in now. They did not desire to continue living. Instead, they desired a clean end to the match and a judge. To end it all. In silence, Huaishur pulled out the sword of virtue, slashed down, and then stopped abruptly. The blade stopped above Ogiest's neck. A few centimeters down, it could easily cut through the gap between the cervical vertebrae, delicately disassemble the bones and muscles, and bring him a quick end and death. But death didn't come. Huaishur slowly raised the blade. "Live, Ogiest," he said, "you have to pay for everything you've done." Ogiest looked up at him and couldn't help but sneer. "Where did this pity come from? Your Excellency Judge?" He asked mockingly, "What's the point of sparing my life? Or do you think death is too gentle for what I've done, and you want me to suffer in prison and live in hell?" "It's meaningless," he said. I'm already in there. I know. Huaishur looked at him and suddenly asked, Do you know how I came out of those records? You should have seen it the moment it was activated, right? Those fantasies. I went deeper than you. Those records entangled with me are more than you can imagine. I'm not far from assimilation. In silence, Ogiest heard Huaishur's answer. It was Kandra who saved me. He froze on the spot, his eyes wide open in shock. He's still conscious, Ogiest. He knows what you've done, and he understands why you've done it. But at the moment when the eternal frost furnace was activated, he sacrificed his last hope of returning to the human world to save me. Unfortunately, Ogiest, even if you can use the immortal machine now, you can't save him. He's already dead. While Ogiest was in a daze, Huaishur lowered his head and told him seriously, I didn't understand until then that the reason why he lingered was not because he wanted to live, but because he couldn't let go of you. At the moment when Kandra left the human world, Huaishur clearly saw his last silent opening and closing of his lips. Those were the last words he left behind. I'm sorry. Was this an apology to Huaishur or his last words to Ogiest? Maybe it was both. He couldn't stop his adopted son from falling into despair, nor could he save the pain and torture in this hell. The man left his last apology and welcomed his end with a smile. But there was one thing that Huaishur could be sure of. Until his death, Kandra never regretted his actions. He didn't regret being swallowed by hell in place of Ogiest. He also didn't regret sacrificing his last hope to save Huaishur. He'd rather let himself fall to that level forever than let you make such a mistake. Huaishur's blade fell again, breaking the shackles on Ogiest. This is the second time he's saved you. Don't let down his good intentions. At that moment, the elder subconsciously put his hand on the handle of the scimitar, guarding against Ogiest's desperate struggle. But the man was still in a daze. He just looked at Huaishur in a daze. After a long, long time, his expression twitched. He didn't know whether he was crying or laughing. It was as if his torn soul was pieced together again. He had regained his freedom, but the pain was as if he had lost everything. He cried silently, If you want a trial, go to the Grand Master and the Purser. They will judge what you've done, but I won't. I have more important things to do. Huaishur waved his hand to disperse the blade and stretched out his hand. Give me the Nibelungen, and you can go. Ogiest didn't say anything more. He raised his palm, and the dim Nibelungen ring on his index finger slowly dissipated. In a flash, it appeared on Huaishur's 10 fingers. In an instant, the sleeping frost giant army was connected to young Master Ming's sacred mark. The dim ring glowed with a blazing light. With Huaishur's advance, a cold winter wind suddenly swept in front of the undead army. The sleeping frost giants walked out of the cold wind and respectfully half-knelt on the ground, waiting for orders from their superiors. Right in front of Huaishur, the shell of the huge tower peeled off layer by layer and fell to the ground with a roar, revealing the complicated machinery and countless changing structures. Between heaven and earth, the central tower was completely unfurled. Dozens of bridges connected the flying modules and buildings to each other, forming this eternal miracle. Endless flames rose from the top of the eternal frost furnace, dispelling the blood rain and the burning wind that shrouded the whole hell, tearing apart the eternal dusk. Grass and trees multiplied, all things grew, and a sweet smell blew in the wind. Amidst the endless wails of despair, an extremely beautiful paradise had descended upon this place. The kingdom of heaven was built on hell. Let's go, everyone. Huaishur looked back at the army behind him and told them, It's time to end it. Since we're already late, don't let people wait too long. Whether it was this war or the painful past, everything would come to an end. It was at that moment, in the frame of the iron crystal throne, on the cover of the empty book, pitch-black ink finally appeared, crisscrossing, and an invisible pen wrote the title, laying the foundation of the miracle. Les Miserables. Chapter 590. At this moment, in the clouds, on the bridge of Ivy's giant flying ship, hundreds of huge monitors enveloped the entire battlefield, reflecting all the changes and conflicts. With the opening of the 4 gates, countless teams poured into the central tower and rushed to the battlefield, fighting for space with their opponents inch by inch. But on the big screen in the middle, an excessively young face appeared. When the frivolous smile on his face dissipated, he became completely different from before. His dark eyes were calm and deep, as if reflecting a bottomless abyss. Just like an evil dragon, so scary. Panned alongside, it seems that we are really unlucky to encounter such an enemy. Behind him, Harley Quinn, who had just recovered from his injury, could not help but shake his head. When we encountered the ivory tower, we knew how bad our luck was, right? He scratched his head and sighed helplessly. Mr. Pandalong, we won't lose, right? Lose? Pandalong squinted and looked over. Harley Quinn, if you put a little more effort into probability, you wouldn't say such stupid things. Please don't make it difficult for a language teacher to learn mathematics, okay? Harley Quinn shook his head and bowed, just like the clown in his code name. He bowed to the master in front of him and sincerely asked for advice. Honorable old sir, what do you think of the victory and defeat in front of you? Originally, it would be 70-30. Who is 70? He asked subconsciously. Pandalong did not even bother to answer. Harley Quinn's eyes widened. Then won't we lose for sure? Our enemy is the ivory tower, the last remaining light of celestial genealogy, the giant that dominated the entire academic world for 110 years, the behemoth that made the Imperial University of Rome bow down to. In the iron crystal is the great Grand Master of the world, the incarnation of miracles that walk on earth. Our next opponent is the Frost Giant Legion, led by the youngest anointed person in history, a military officer with an internal rating of S-class by the Asian Astronomical Association. Pandalong asked doubtfully, challenging such a person, why do you think we can't possibly lose? Harley Quinn was stunned and looked around. This was because Pandalong's voice was not concealed at all. It had even spread to everyone's ears. The busy members turned around in confusion and looked at the old man's back. What's so surprising about it? The old man also looked back at them and asked indifferently, did we come here to lose? Could it be that we have persevered until now just to surrender? From Rome to London and then to America, the long journey of displacement, division, struggle, poverty, and hunger. 400 years of suffering did not defeat us. Even today, we still stand on the shoulders of giants. Back then, the sages who established the name of the Ivy League blazed a path through thistles and thorns and finally sent us here. Don't say stupid things like returning home whenever you see a tall mountain. The skinny old man opened his mouth and roared at his subordinates like a lion. We have to walk the rest of the way by ourselves. Will we lose? Would it fail? Or was he afraid of being humiliated and ridiculed? Could it be that such an insignificant thing had any value to be talked about? What's really worth pursuing? Can we not do it just because we will lose? This is just the first step. Even if we lose, there will be a second step, a third step. As long as we don't die, the challenge will continue, not only because we are afraid of the anger of the sages, but also not because we are worried that the future generations will ridicule us. It is for the noble dream that we represent that has been passed down for 357 years. Even if the enemy is an invincible grandmaster, as long as the soul of the seeker exists, we will not bow under the shadow of the truth. In the dead silence, Pandalong opened his eyes wide. His old eyes seemed to be burning with the wildfire of inheritance as he stared at every face. So, stick out your chest, everyone, and don't lower your heads. He raised his head and solemnly told everyone here, "We have done what we can do, and what we could not do in the past. After such a long chase, we are finally standing on the same starting line as our opponents. Regardless of success or failure, our efforts will not be in vain, because one day the pursuit of your life and mine will become a new cornerstone and let the monument of the Ivy League rise above the White Tower." He said, "Victory will belong to us in the end." The moment Pandalong raised his hand and clenched his fist, the thin, dead silence was broken by 100,000 times the surging enthusiasm. The sound of whistling was like thunder bursting forth from the thin old man thousands of meters high in the sky. The atmosphere that had gradually become tense became extremely restless at this moment. Wildfires were ignited in those fanatical eyes. And this announcement was also transmitted to the ears of every Ivy League member on the battlefield through different methods, causing this noble dream that had been passed down for nearly 400 years to reverberate in everyone's hearts, dispelling all the hesitation and uneasiness. Surrounded by countless thunderbolts and storms, the light of the otherworldly underworld once again spread out in all directions. The miracle from America traveled through hell, bringing with it the truth from America. After waiting for too many years, those souls that thirsted for victory once again challenged the unattainable opponent. For victory. When the mastermind of the war chip took over the command of the entire battlefield, Pandalong finally handed over the authority at hand and went through the elevator to the login area. After a short wait, he asked the person next to him, "How's Liz?" "She has arrived at the battlefield, and she's in great condition." Harley Quinn tilted his head and glanced at the display on his arm. He raised his eyebrows. "Also, she asked me to tell you, everything is good, but it's too long-winded. Next time, please simplify it to less than 10 seconds. Pandalong was stunned for a moment. Then he immediately laughed. "That's too much to ask." As the elevator door opened, the hurricane of the deck area swept over. A dark aircraft was at the end, waiting for a long time. In the pilot's seat, the colonel smoked his last cigarette and looked back at Pandalong sitting in the seat. He frowned. "Old man, are you sure you want to go up personally? It doesn't matter if you're not there. The battlefield is not your classroom." The students have already gone to the battlefield. As a teacher, I have to walk in the front and set an example. Pandalong put on his helmet and showed a mocking smile under the mask. "Don't show off your resume to the old paratroopers from the Battle of Baghdad. Kid, if you want me to admit that I'm old, it's still 10 years too early." Yes, that's right. He hasn't aged yet, and he can still move forward. The giants carrying the ivy haven't fallen yet. Is that so? In the iron crystal seat, the chief engineer looked down at the report that was submitted. All the members of the troop had appeared on the battlefield 3 minutes ago, and that group of ivy guys seemed to have taken an aphrodisiac. They were panting heavily and rushing forward without any regard for their lives. The scholar team and the exploration team were caught off guard by this group of guys, and the cryogenic cabin was almost not enough. The chief engineer scratched his head in distress. It seems that those guys are really going all out. After being blocked by the ivory tower for so many years, no matter who it is, they will be anxious, right? The purser calmly looked at the screen in front of him and adjusted the index to ensure the stability of the Heavenly Kingdom array and maintain the mystic apparatus. Too much power was operating in the iron crystal seat, causing this huge submarine to become a powder keg. As long as it lost its balance slightly, it would probably collapse. Not only would the newborn Heavenly Kingdom record die in the womb, but the Grandmaster would probably be seriously injured. Without the help of Utopia's mainframe and the three wise men, such a huge mystic apparatus was still too difficult for an individual. He had to use all his energy to deal with it and had no time to care about anything else. The chief engineer's task was also not easy, but he couldn't help but shake his head when he saw the purser's leisurely expression. He was even taking a break from his work and making tea on the spot with a stopwatch. "Can't you be a little nervous?" "What's the use of being nervous? Since I can't roll up my sleeves and rush down to beat them up, I might as well drink tea here and cultivate my mind." The purser took a teapot and a scale from the laboratory and focused on calculating the amount of tea leaves in micrograms. He wrote down a row of formulas on the paper that had been ground into powder to calculate the effect of the tea leaves' age on the final quality of the soup. Finally, after accurate calculation, the tea leaves were ground into powder, more than 10 times the usual amount plus a bunch of things that should not appear in the teapot, and put them into the boiling water and covered the lid. Next, there was only waiting filled with anticipation. Soon, 2 cups of alchemy medicine that had been highly purified by the alchemy cauldron and had become a stimulant to a certain extent were placed in front of the chief engineer. Just by looking at the dark color, he knew that nothing good would happen after drinking it. "Want some?" The purser invited expectantly. The chief engineer picked up the teacup. Just by smelling it, he had the illusion of reliving his life. He began to wonder if this old man had been bribed by the other party and had begun to poison the iron crystal seat. "Why is it that after so many years, your skills haven't improved at all?" "Next time, I'll definitely." He hesitated again and again, but in the end, he did not have the courage to try. He even tried to lean back a little bit to get away from the teacup. "Didn't you say the same thing last time? Last time is different from this time." The chief engineer rolled his eyes and finally asked, "Are you really not going to do anything?" "I'm not doing anything." The purser sipped his poison-grade tea and calmly replied, "Since there is a voice in the iron crystal seat, there should not be a second one. There only needs to be one protagonist on the stage. All the interference from us behind-the-scenes personnel will have unpredictable consequences for the secret instrument that is in the end of the story stage." As he spoke, he looked up and asked, "If the murder in the locked room was solved by a roadside tea seller in the end, the readers won't buy it, right? When all the causes and effects are connected, any mechanical god summoning will cause irreparable damage to the story itself. Forster, I know you don't care about our agreement with the Ivy League, but the more urgent the situation is, the more patience we have to have." "This again. What else? Since we have promised something, we must do it. Whether it's with the enemy or with ourselves, a magnanimous life should be like this." The purser pushed the teacup over, looked into his eyes, and told him, "Come, have some tea." The corner of Forster's eyes twitched violently. Under the gaze of his old friend, his scalp went numb. "Let's hope everything goes smoothly." He sighed, picked up the teacup, raised his head, and drank it in one gulp. In front of his eyes, countless illusions began to appear. In this sudden bitterness, he finally understood something. Some damn agreements. It actually did not matter if he did not keep them. Unfortunately, it was too late. Chapter 591. Those old bastards are probably drinking tea and watching the show, right? Amidst the turbulence and rumbling, Huaisher looked up at the direction of the iron crystal seat at the corner of the narrow corridor. He could only see the dust falling from the ceiling. For some reason, he suddenly had a feeling of being persecuted. Those old guys must be laughing happily now. Once someone came out to take the blame, he would happily drink tea and watch the show. They might even find all kinds of excuses to slack off at such a critical moment. He knew the nature of the celestial genealogy too well, persecuting newcomers, slacking off, attacking teammates. Which one had he not done before? Just by looking at how he had been alone for so long and how there were no reinforcements at all, other than the occasional encounter between two similar exploration teams, he knew that something was wrong. No matter how he thought about it, these guys did it on purpose. Amidst the loud noise, the premonition of death suddenly came. Weisher suddenly lowered his head. The wall in front of him suddenly cracked, revealing the tragic scene in the hall behind. Blood was dripping, and the large group of mutants were still cruelly killing each other. The Undying Army's second attack was fruitless as well. After suffering heavy casualties, the Undying Army finally chose to retreat. "Please give us another 15 minutes, Your Excellency." The revered elder who was covered in blood pushed away the support of his deputy and promised, "Why, sure, the enemy is already exhausted. We will definitely be able to break through this defense in another 15 minutes. Our side is also exhausted, aren't we?" Weisher shook his head. "It's not a matter of time, revered elder. The undead army is not used to fighting in such a narrow area. Without depth, they can't use their mobility. If this continues, it will only increase the casualties." He said, "Now that the casualties have reached 1/5, according to the contract, you can already retreat and rest, right?" The revered elder opened his eyes wide and was about to say something, but he heard Weisher's firm order, "I'll leave the escort of the wounded to you. Even after leaving the tower, you can still support the external battlefield, right? Please leave the rest to me." In a short silence, the revered elder slowly nodded and waved his hand to signal his tired subordinates to prepare for the retreat. "Thank you for your efforts and sacrifices." Weisher nodded and said goodbye, expressing his gratitude. "Apart from the commission, I really don't know how to repay you for your bravery." "I will." "Sir Weisher." The elder interrupted him for the first time. His eyes were wide open as if he had been humiliated. The wound on his face ruptured due to his anger, and blood flowed out again. "Do you think that we are fighting so bravely for more money?" Weisher was stunned and did not know how to answer. "Your Excellency, even in hell, there are times when heroes are hoped to exist." The venerable elder bowed and said, "It is the same for a large group like ours. I believe that everything is under the guidance of the Ring of Eternity. It is a pity that we cannot witness what happens next." As he spoke, he took a step back and solemnly bade farewell. "I wish you success." "Thank you." After a moment of silence, Weisher solemnly promised, "Although I don't think I'm a hero, this victory will also belong to you." The venerable elder seemed to smile and did not say anything else. He turned around and left. The injured members of the exploration team, as well as the scholars and alchemists, were all within the range of this retreat, including Yuan and Lin Shurjo. Other than the 5 members of the exploration team who were in good condition, there were also the Gargoyles and the Frost Giant Legion who had finished resting. The silent frost giants silently propped themselves up with their axes and relied on the narrow staircase to recover their strength. The chill spread with the sound of the axes rubbing against the stones. It filled people with an indescribable sense of peace. After sensing the departure of the undead army, the Eye of Nightmare, which had the geographical advantage behind the broken wall, began to be eager to try. Similarly, Weisher was also eager to give it a try. During the 20 minutes of rest and long wait, the alchemy bomb in Weisher's hand had shrunk to the size of a fist. It was crystal clear, like a purple crystal cube. After injecting 1/3 of the source substance into it, it seemed to have reached its limit. The source substance in it began to intensify and become restless, jumping with unsettling electric light. It was unknown when it would explode. Across the wall, Weisher silently counted down. The cube in his hand spun silently, and the electric light became more and more dazzling. The frost giants stood up one by one, and thick frost armor grew on their naked greenish-gray bodies again. The axes in their hands became more and more red in the burning. This was the Nibelungen from the person in charge of the exploration team. It was different from the new version in Weischer's hands. In addition to the previous vitality, it had been personally modified by the Grand Master. It could be said to be a deluxe edition. At the same time, it was also the greatest manifestation of the Iron Crystal Constellation's combat power. A whole team of 34 frost giants slept in that world covered by eternal ice and snow. 34 rank 3 sublimators who were also stigmata, and they were frost giants who were famous for being good at frontal combat in celestial genealogy. Even if they did not have the help of the border relics and souls, they did not have the natural instinct of humans to be afraid of death. They would not be afraid of battle. To them, death was nothing more than returning to that eternal storm. As long as there was enough source substance, they could soon grow out of the snowfield in the form of ice crystals again. Fortunately, after a short rest, most of the frost giants had recovered their strength, enough to launch another round of attacks with Weischer. In silence, Weischer counted down, waiting for the chaotic sounds behind the broken wall to get closer and closer, crossing the edge of the prediction boundary. The cube in Weischer's hand was suddenly thrown behind the wall. The alchemy bomb, mixed with a large amount of poisonous blood and metal fuel, was shattered in midair by a whistling arrow. However, the flames produced still spread in an instant. The dancing red seemed to have a volume, with a thick texture, whistling and extending. Inch by inch, it filled the air. Even though they were on guard, the heat flow that was enough to burn the lungs swept across the huge hall, causing chaotic roars and shouts. In Weischer's hand, the burning banner suddenly stabbed down. The rolling darkness followed his body and suddenly flashed, falling into the burning field of fire. Shadow Burial Shuttle. Under the heat, the distorted air provided him with an instant cover. The door of the bone burial sanctuary opened, and countless ghost crows flew out from it, covering the sky and the sun. After creating a brief moment of chaos, they dissipated into the air, without warning. Instead, there was the roar of the wall breaking. The entire hall shook violently. Under the impact of more than a dozen frost giants, the metal wall that was full of cracks instantly fell off and flew forward, crushing the burning flames on the ground. Sparks burst out. Frost wind emerged from the heat flow of the flames. The frost giants, who were more than 3 meters tall, roared and ran wildly. Ignoring the difference in height between them, they once again attacked the Eye of Nightmare on the steps. The huge heavy sword and two-handed axe slashed down, setting off a mournful howl. Another sharp whistle was heard above the dome. The huge fireballs that were flying around suddenly shook, and Salamander flew down in the flames. But what awaited them was a ferocious outline walking out of the bone burial sanctuary. The candle crow flew into the card. As the card shattered, the park guards appeared from the darkness again, with heavy shotguns in their hands. They pulled the bolts in unison and aimed at the enemy in the sky. Then they praised piously. Holy! The cone-shaped iron fire shot out, and the intensified silver and alloy spread out like a rainstorm. For Salamander, a large group of abyss demons who were born unable to wear armor and defense, this kind of weapon with a huge coverage and shocking short-range power was simply their nemesis. Fireballs kept exploding above their heads, and the flames fell to the ground like rain. They were immediately extinguished by the frost wind. In the extreme cold, all the salamander that fell to the ground and tried to struggle were stomped to death. After resting, the frost giants posed an unprecedented threat to the Eye of Nightmare's defense, attracting most of its attention. Weischer glanced at the gargoyles behind him. He raised his sword and pointed at the commander behind the heavy armor. Thus, The gargoyles with spears on their backs spread their wings and fanned the hurricane. The huge demons flapped their wings and flew up, but soon they landed on the ground in a sorry state. The weight of ironstone pressed a huge crack on the ground. Not only them, but everyone, including Huaishur, felt their bodies suddenly sink. It was as if something invisible was pressing down on their shoulders, and they almost couldn't bear it. The gravity instantly increased by more than 5 times. It was difficult to move. There was a scholar who specialized in the law of gravity hidden among the enemy. However, it was useless. When Huaishur arrived in front of the bunker under the protection of the frost giants, the fragile temporary defense had already come to an end. In his hand, the hammer of pain quickly extended. Amidst the praise of the park guards, the eyes of the wolf had burst out with a furious light. It extracted the despair in the air and became more and more ferocious. It actually grew sharp dragon scales. It changed qualitatively. It was as if something left behind by the final dragon, Bahamut, had been awakened, showing unprecedented ferocity and anger. Even the jet behind it began to expand and grow with the sharp sound of metal rubbing against each other. Suffering would instinctively gather towards suffering, and the souls of despair would more easily understand where despair was. When the pain left behind by the 100,000 lizardmen felt the wails of hell, these origin substances that had already merged with the weapons could not suppress their anger. Towards this hell, the souls that had already transcended burst out with anger. At that moment, a dragon's roar burst out from the hammer, tearing through all the noise. Even the endless wails were suppressed by that roar. The iron wind howled. The earth rumbled. Huaishur's hands actually lost their sense of touch for a short time. Then he saw the airwaves spread out. The barrier and bunker in front of him quickly fell apart, crushed into the most basic sand by an invisible force. With a residual force that was enough to wedge into steel, it spread backward. Dizziness and shock suddenly came. His fragile eardrums could not withstand the ravaging, and blood seeped out. A huge crack extended straight forward from where the hammer landed, penetrating the entire eye of Nightmare's array and climbing up the wall behind them. Behind the crack, the complicated structure of the eternal frost furnace revealed a ferocious corner. A cold wind blew from the darkness. It blew until everyone's scalps went numb. Huaishur had already crossed the bunker. Under the protection of the park guards, he was very close. Time is of the essence, gentlemen. He looked around at the twitching faces and asked softly, "So, either surrender or die. Have you decided?" Chapter 592. 2 minutes later, in the dead silence, only the faint vibrations and shouts from the distance and the lower levels could be heard. The meandering scarlet flowed down the stairs, dyeing the edges of the crack on the ground red. Just under Huaishur's feet, the crack had already begun to repair itself and close. It was like a monster chewing on its food, slowly squirming. Gradually, the wriggling limbs and faces in the asphalt-like viscous liquid could no longer be seen. The wails faded into the distance. Huaishur had tried to kill them before, but they had already been completely connected to the entire eternal frost furnace. Even if he pulled them out, they would quickly collapse into ashes. It wouldn't take long for the remaining ashes to be pulled back by an invisible force, returning to the crack and reforming into a numb face. Everything here was like this. It was impossible to completely destroy it. The supreme results left behind by the Creator's back then were naturally the most precious and durable types of metals. They could even extract origin substance to repair themselves, almost like living things. Now, these living metals had connected them together, turning them into a despairing whole. Huaishur took one last look at the crack behind him, stepped onto a higher level, and headed for the top. As he gradually climbed higher, he had already reached the middle of the tower. The style of the buildings he saw became more and more strange and unimaginable. The art from hell was displayed here, as the tower unfolded and grew. Even the walls of the tower could no longer cover the gradually expanding furnace core, revealing the peaceful and serene land outside. In the beautiful world that was like a paradise, large groups of people were still fighting fiercely, giving scarlet blood to the earth, and Weisher was still going up. The higher he went, the more he could see that countless forks were converging. As long as he went up, it seemed that no matter which door he chose, he would be able to reach the same destination. All the climbers would eventually converge. There were more and more enemies. Not only the Eye of Nightmare and the Ivy League's ascendants, but there were also all kinds of strange groups they had hired, as well as scholars and alchemists. There were even war machines left behind by the Hell Workshop's master before he was defeated. The speed at which he advanced and climbed was getting slower and slower, and the situation was getting more and more troublesome. One battle after another. Just like the wailing here, there was no end in sight. 2 hours later, Weisher sat on the steps, exhausted. He stared at the messy corpses in front of him, his fingers trembling slightly. Too many battles, too many enemies. Even young Master Ming, who was good at recovering, felt an irresistible tiredness. After using up the last of the origin substance he had obtained from the Ivy sect, he was able to recover some of his energy. The wound on his arm had already healed under the effects of the silver blood potion. However, the metallic scars still remained on his body, making him look extremely miserable. How far is it? He leaned against a pillar and stared at the ceiling above him. None of the frost giants, who had suffered severe casualties, responded. They just silently sharpened their weapons, seized the time to rest, and waited for the next departure or for the enemy to appear again. Looking up from the edge of the cracked tower, the top of the tower seemed to be hanging high without the slightest bit of distance. It was as if it had been walking on the same spot. This climb was too long, and he was almost exhausted. It was as if she was afraid that he would feel lonely. The sound of iron boots rubbing against the floor once again sounded from the stairs below. The heavy footsteps from the Eye of Nightmare overlapped. Beside Weisher, the frost giants who were sitting cross-legged on the ground slowly stood up, carried their heavy weapons, and turned their heads to look in the direction of the entrance. There, a 10-man team of the Eye of Nightmare slowly walked up the stairs. Their armor, which was covered in cuts, carried the smell of blood. The emblem of the Eye of Nightmare on their shoulders and shields slowly opened. It glowed with a blood-red light. They assumed an attacking posture and strode forward. The battle had begun. Weisher sighed, supported himself with the Sword of Virtue, and slowly stood up. He raised his sword and pointed it at the enemy. There was no need for any orders or words. The frost giants were already running wildly towards the enemy in the icy wind. The giant axes cut through the air and collided with the steel. A loud sound burst forth. Weisher turned his body to dodge the curse arrow that flew from behind the shield. He stepped forward and nimbly turned around the incoming sword. His palm was already pressed on the attacker's helmet. At that moment, a sound like a torrent of water burst forth from his slender fingers. It was the surging flow of blood. When it washed through the thin blood vessels and merged with each other, it emitted a genuine, thunderous roar. The heavenly drum sounded. Drummer! A terrifying force comparable to a pile driver erupted from his palm. The violent force sent the opponent flying backward, knocking down several of his teammates. He was smashed into the wall and could not move. The ferocious helmet quickly shattered, revealing the rough and cold face below. It was filled with calmness. Even when Weisher stepped forward with his sword, he did not show the slightest change in expression. He faced death calmly. However, Huaisher's footsteps stopped for a moment. He looked at his face and suddenly asked, "What's your name?" The Eye of Nightmare's ascendant frowned, but he did not say anything. His eyes drooped as he waited for death. "Can't you speak? Are you unwilling to talk to me, or are you simply unable to speak?" Amidst the noise, Huaisher's calm voice sounded. "Half an hour ago, I seem to have killed you once. Don't you remember?" The Eye of Nightmare's mercenary was stunned. Then, he seemed to have finally recalled something, and his face turned pale. He was in a daze. It was as if he could not believe it. "It's a good habit to remember the people you killed, right?" Huaisher looked around and ignored the fighting around him. He pinched his chin and fell into deep thought. "So, have I been pulled into some kind of illusion? No. Unless it's an illusion at the level of the crown wearer, it shouldn't have any effect on me." The mirror of nothingness also didn't see anything. Then, what kind of border relic is this that uses this tower to create some kind of effect? To be able to affect so many people, it should be close to the scope of a miracle engraving, right? To be able to have such a degree of completion, there should be laws and secret instruments inside. It hasn't reached the level of a creator or a grandmaster. Such technical ability. "Ivy, let me think." After a moment of silence, he raised his head and asked softly, "If I'm not wrong, this should be a trick of the troupe, right?" With his words, the battle came to an end. That was because all the Eye of Nightmare's movements had stopped. Then, as if they had woken up from a dream, they finally realized where they were. They looked around blankly and slowly dissipated into the air, never to be seen again. However, the scenery of the surrounding tower was rapidly changing. Magnificent decorations appeared in the air, accompanied by gorgeous murals, thick curtains, high-hanging crystal lamps, and other furnishings. It was as if they had arrived on a stage in an instant. What they saw was actually a theater that was so gorgeous that it was indescribable with words. Outside the stage, in the semicircular stands, countless seats were filled. Countless illusory figures were holding exquisite binoculars and looking out. Boos rang out one after another. It was obvious that they were very angry with Huaisher, the actor, for breaking the fourth wall without permission. Huaisher's surroundings suddenly darkened. In the darkness, a beam of light suddenly fell and illuminated the old man standing there. He was wearing a mask and had changed into luxurious and tasteless clothes. His 10 fingers were full of precious rings. "Panned along," he introduced himself. Then a second beam of light illuminated a man wearing a scholar's attire, a top hat, and glasses. He introduced himself, "Doctor." Then it was the Major, Harley Quinn, whom he had seen before. Then an elegant and beautiful masked lady in a whalebone dress appeared from the light and bowed slightly. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Huaisher. I'm Isabella." Finally, it was a young farmer in ordinary clothes who looked tired and tired. "I'm Piero." In addition to the other 4 members who were far away in the present realm, more than half of the troop in the Village of Dusk had come here and stood in front of Huaisher. The stingy rich man, the ignorant doctor, the cowardly major, the pompous servant, the vain lady, the cunning farmer, the pillars to maintain the story had been propped up, and the characters had appeared. They had become Huaisher's enemies. Huaisher raised his eyebrows and sighed. "To be honest, I thought it would be Liz. Liz won't come here. Huaisher, you don't have to worry about where she's hiding to prepare a sneak attack." Pan DeLong raised his hand, lifted the brim of his hat, and said solemnly, "The students have set foot on the battlefield, and the teachers should also try their best to pave the way for them in the future and eliminate a little bumps. Now, in front of you, there's only us, only the troop." Huaisher couldn't help but shake his head. How can you say such a despicable thing in such a dignified way? It can't be helped. Just like some stigmata are particularly good at fighting, some stigmata are particularly bad at it. Pan de Long responded leisurely. Unlike other stigmata, the stigmata of the troop needs to be fully prepared to be used, and it's basically useless in normal times. After all, most of us are teachers and scholars, and we're not good at fighting and killing. So when we have to fight, we try to outnumber the enemy just like now. Before he finished speaking, Huaishur pulled out Lord of the Flies without warning and aimed at Pan de Long's face. Using the same trick, he pulled the trigger. Ultra-small judgment institution, Lord of the Flies, maximum effort, liberation. A dazzling beam of light flew out silently at that moment. With a high temperature, it tore the old face apart, penetrated his body, and then flew out of the theater. Chapter 593. In front of the light of judgment. The walls of the theater fell apart. But then they started to repair quickly. The majestic and blazing light of judgment was trapped in the theater and couldn't break out. It couldn't even break through the outermost curtain hanging in front of the stands. Then it collapsed into turbulent origin substance and disappeared without a trace. Huaishur froze in place. "I'm sorry, Mr. Huaishur." The lips on the face pierced by Beelzebub opened and closed, still speaking. According to Ivy's calculations, as long as you have the stigmata of 5 theater members, you won't be able to use that weapon to break the Golden Palace from the inside. As he spoke, his face quickly repaired and healed, returning to its original state. He didn't even lose a hair. It was still calm. By the way, before the next scene starts, all attacks on actors will be punished. Look, the audience is angry. The stands were in an uproar. They angrily scolded this rude person who broke into the stage and used violence. As soon as they finished speaking, a bolt of lightning fell from the sky without warning and landed on Huaishur's arm. Before Huaishur could even react, his hand holding the gun lost all feeling. After a long time, the uncontrollable pain spread from under the cracked skin, causing him to stagger and gasp violently. Amidst Pan de Long's white hair, there were faint edges and corners. It seemed to be a crown made of withered osmanthus leaves, decorated with gold and jewels, but it had lost its former color and glory. Dream of the Golden Palace, a relic from the border of Rome, the last creation left by a tyrannical king in history, the miracle theater, Golden Palace, which was a match made in heaven with the theater group. After combining with its existence, the effect caused by the combination of stigmata actually jumped to the level of a miracle engraving, changing reality and creating miracles, just like the grace and traces left behind by God. "Don't waste your energy, Mr. Huaishur," Pan de Long said indifferently. Pan de Long said indifferently, "We won't be stupid enough to fight you in close combat, and we won't take any risks for the sake of victory. For us, it's enough as long as we can hold you back." Enduring the pain caused by the healing of the wound on his arm and the growth of his flesh, Huaishur grinned and mocked. "I thought you guys were going through so much trouble for something. Don't you have any dreams at all?" Everyone looked at him indifferently, and no one responded. Even the most hot-tempered colonel didn't say a word. He only focused his attention on Huaishur. He did not slack off at all, as if he was facing a great enemy. "Next, I will be performing a legendary epic adventure, an immortal elegy of resistance." Pan de Long held up his cane and looked at the audience in the stands like an announcer. He announced passionately, "Cheers, everyone. The wonderful story is about to begin. Cheers, everyone. This is the noble crystal presented by a true warrior. Next, please continue to enjoy Spartacus." At that moment, Isabella opened her mouth and sang loudly. The perfect soprano sang, the prelude of a classical tragedy. The world on the stage shook with a bang, and everything changed. Huaishi's vision blurred, as if he had fallen into the abyss, but then he stood firm again. In the sudden dizziness, he looked around in amazement. Everything was completely different. In an instant, the theater turned into the Colosseum. Behind the towering walls, countless audiences were shouting excitedly, but Huaishi's skin quickly darkened and turned into a suntanned bronze. All the equipment on his body disappeared without a trace. His clothes were ragged, and he looked around blankly like a slave. Around him, the frost giants were also shrinking quickly, and they became the size of ordinary people. Like Huaishi, they were unkempt, but they were a little more burly and had lost their frost and ice armor. Soon, Huaishi found that his divine mark had disappeared, along with the continuous clattering sounds. Heavy sledgehammers, sharp axes, sacrificial knives, long spears, chains. They fell from his body one after another and landed on the ground, except for the wolf head on the hammer, which still looked a little ferocious. There was nothing magical about it anymore. It had become an ordinary weapon that was much harder. "Help! I'm cracking, cracking, cracking!" At his waist, Beelzebub screamed in horror. It quickly changed from a modern weapon to a broken crossbow. He tried to shake it. He could no longer say anything. All the foreign objects that did not fit the background welcomed the correction. Everything was pulled into the imaginary world formed by the troupe. With the Golden Palace dream as the stage, the 6 members of the troupe unfolded the legendary story again. They pushed Huaishi into it by force. The never-ending battle was about to begin. Right in front of Huaishi, the gladiator was on the verge of death, struggling with all his might. "Spartacus! Spartacus! Spartacus!" In the stands, the audience, who had turned into Roman citizens, shouted excitedly. They waved their fists and urged with great fanaticism, "Kill it! Spartacus! Kill that bastard!" Lyra was constantly thrown from above and landed on Huaishi's shoulder. "I am Spartacus?" Huaishi raised her head in astonishment and looked at the audience. She suddenly realized what had happened, but an invisible force attached to him, forcing him to raise his dagger and point it at the enemy in front of him. The prelude to the slaughter. This was the fate of Spartacus. Intense dizziness and trance suddenly hit him. The huge theater began to modify Huaishi's consciousness and memory, making him accept the fate that was close at hand. However, in front of the pair of eyes that suddenly looked up, he failed. "No." Huaishi raised his head with difficulty, stared at them, and said softly, "I am not Spartacus. I am not your gladiator." The sound of something shattering rang out from Huaishi's sword. The dagger suddenly broke. The shape of the sword quickly changed, forming an ancient and damaged sword blade that emitted a faint glow. Just above his head, a crown intertwined with light suddenly appeared, forcibly squeezing into the prelude of this tragedy, blooming with light. Under the illumination of the light, the invisible force that controlled Huaishi disappeared without a trace. "I am Huaishi." At that moment, Huaishi raised his head and told them, "Prince of Paradise, Huaishi." The sword of virtue lit up. The sonorous sound of the sword suddenly spread, tearing apart the suppression of the Golden Theater, and everything that had been modified returned to its original appearance. The frost wind swept, and the frost giants shrouded in ice and iron pulled out their heavy axes again, revealing their burly and huge bodies. They roared to the sky. The script was destroyed. The tragedy came to an abrupt end. "Sorry, I am Drama Tyrant." Huaishi grinned, smiled at the highest point of the Colosseum, and shook his head mockingly. "This kind of plot that will destroy the image of my idol must be modified." Everything stopped in an instant. At the highest point of the Colosseum, Pandalong's figure appeared, looking down indifferently. Paradise. I didn't expect this title to have the power to modify the Golden Palace. But unfortunately, I'm afraid this is not enough. With that, he waved his hand gently. The gates in all directions of the Colosseum suddenly opened, and huge beasts and majestic figures walked out, as well as a fully armed legion. There was no end in sight, and no edge in sight. It was as if there was no end to it. A low, singing voice began. A soprano sang in the void, and there were low voices of men. The stigmata that belonged to the troupe operated on this narrow stage, making all the illusory faces more and more real, and making the hero's eyes burst out with tangible flames. The script of Spartacus is still going on. Let's skip those annoying lines and plot, and go straight to the most exciting part. Panda Long said coldly, "Mr. Huaishur, your final battle has begun." Huaishur was already stunned in place. As if he couldn't believe it, he listened to the song echoing in his ears, and his eyebrows slowly raised. "Opera? What a coincidence." He said, "I know this thing too." At that moment, Huaishur raised the sword of virtue, raised it in front of his eyes, and asked with a smile, "Since you know me so well, you won't forget. Where did this sword come from, right?" In his hand, the sword of virtue trembled violently, as if it was about to wake up, and it glowed with a faint light. Until now, he realized that the stage of the Golden Palace seemed to have the same effect on both sides. If that was the case, at this moment, between the sad opera excerpts, a grand melody suddenly played, tearing apart the sad singing, and turned into a melody of redemption. Around Huaishur, dozens of handsome and dignified figures suddenly appeared in the air. After crossing the long hell, the princes sleeping in the abyss opened their eyes. Under the call of this stage, they answered the summons. Among them, some had long curly hair, some were vigorous with swords, some were dancing with fire, and some were dignified. But without exception, each of them wore their own crown on their head. It was as if they could hear the screams of kittens that had been wronged. Huaishur smiled, raised his sword, and pointed it at the enemies in front of him. "Kill them!" Silence suddenly fell. In the short silence, nothing happened except for the frost giants that rushed forward while howling. The princes were still standing in the same place, still translucent, like ghosts. Huaishur looked back blankly, feeling very embarrassed. "Why aren't you moving?" In the short silence, the princes looked at each other. Among them, the nameless prince that Huaishur was most familiar with shrugged, helplessly, "Sorry, we are just projections, and we don't have the ability to kill the enemy. What are you talking about?" Huaishur was in disbelief. "Then what are you doing here?" Blessing?" The princes looked at each other, and one of them, a prince with black hair and white skin, said, "I grant you courage, although you do not lack it. I want to grant your excellency compassion, but your excellency already has compassion in your heart. Temperance. What about passion?" Huaishur wanted to say something, but stopped. Holding on to the last glimmer of hope, he asked, "Can't you give me something useful? The kind that can kill them. Did you bring it when you came?" The princes fell silent and looked at each other. In the end, they sighed and said, "If that's the case, then there's only one way left. However, this is the prince's trump card. If it's misused, it will inevitably attract trouble." Huaishur's eyes widened, and he was pleasantly surprised. "Really? Tell me quickly." "Then call out loudly, 'Your Highness.'" The nameless prince pressed on Huaishur's shoulder and said solemnly, "Call for a miracle. In this way, this stage, and the paradise will definitely respond to you." What the hell? Huaishur did not expect that the teammates he summoned would be so lousy. "If I shout, 'Help!' someone will come to save me?" What kind of logic was this? But the moment Huaishur shouted, "Help!" it was as if some mechanism was activated. The princes smiled mysteriously and quickly dissipated in the air. The drifting light gathered in one place and slowly rose, forming an illusory arch. Behind the light gate, a handsome white horse came out. Its eyebrows were arrogant, and it looked so familiar. Even its fat was exactly the same as the fat horse in his house. It glanced at Huaishur with eyes full of disdain. "You call for help every time. Can you do it, little brother?" Huaishur did not have time to ask what it was here, for before he was attracted by the figure on the horse's back. Unbelievable. Although I don't know what's going on, it seems that I was pulled here to help. Are you asking me for help, Huaishur? On the white horse, Luo Xian smiled sweetly. "I'm fighting for you, Your Highness." Chapter 594. Did you run into some trouble? Luo Xian smiled from atop her white horse. Using the sleeping paradise as a medium, the princess who had inherited the path to paradise had answered Huaishur's summons. Huaishur was stunned. He felt as if he was hallucinating, unable to believe the scene in front of him. He even suspected that this was an illusion created by the troupe. But right before his eyes, in this chaotic and ferocious gladiator arena, when a massive shadow suddenly appeared, the dark green pterosaur spread its wings and descended from the sky, spitting out dragon flames. Luo Xian raised her head and gazed at the rapidly growing shadow in front of her. She smiled slightly and raised her slender arms. Her hands overlapped, her fingers clenched tightly, and she clasped them together somewhat awkwardly. She practiced a technique that she hadn't practiced in a long time. When the countless strands of origin substance and the ordinary muscle strength gathered together, a violent wave of qi suddenly burst forth from her tightly clenched palms. Thunder boomed, wildly erupting. It tore apart everyone's eardrums. The violent power of the heavenly pillar's collapse erupted as her fists advanced. The instant the white fist and the sharp dragon claw came into contact, it actually caused such a shocking and terrifying boom. Amidst the explosion, the pouncing dragon suddenly froze in midair. Terrifying heat burst forth from beneath its cracked scales. The vast, destructive power rushed through its body, as if it had pushed the first domino, triggering a chain reaction of despair. It was as if a long nail had been inserted into its chest, ripping apart the dragon's heart and causing the origin substance within to explode. A gentle death covered every part of its body. The massive and heavy body was blown away by the wind, turning into ash and disappearing without a trace. Huaishur's jaw was about to hit the ground. It was as if a lesson he hadn't heard in a long time was being replayed in front of him. This was an advanced application of the drummer that he still couldn't reach. He could only rely on his clumsy imitation to simulate the 3 thunderclaps. It was flawless. The sky collapsed. "It seems like now isn't the time to chat." Luo Xian turned around and looked at the stunned Huaishur. "Let's talk about it later, right? Can you explain the matter of the child later?" In that instant, Huaishur felt as if he had been struck by lightning. He felt like he was drowning in an ocean of death. But soon, the terrifying illusion disappeared. On horseback, Luo Xian smiled mischievously. "I'm just kidding, don't be afraid." Yes, I'm not afraid." Huaishur nodded vigorously. He could feel his legs trembling madly. Cold sweat was pouring down like rain. He couldn't move. What was going on? This feeling of being so close to death. Also, how many hours had it been? Had the gossip already spread to the present realm? He swallowed his saliva and finally realized the consequences of his words. He felt his vision darken. "I'm going to die, right?" Luo Xian only glanced at him a few times, as if she had already seen through his progress and achievements during this period of time. She became a little troubled. "Have you been too lazy in the ivory tower? You haven't improved in a long time, right?" No. I think that my progress is very normal. It's already very fast. Senior sister, not everyone can be like you and be able to improve their skills even if they travel around. Huaisher wanted to say something, but hesitated. The corners of his eyes twitched. He didn't know where to start. I heard that you've taken in 2 students. Remember not to teach them the basics. It's very troublesome to correct them. It's actually easier to clean house. Luo Xian said indifferently. The white horse leisurely moved forward, crossing the chaotic beast dueling arena, leaving behind a cloud of dust along the way. All the enemies were literally blown to smithereens by this monster-like girl. She casually waved her hand. She didn't try to parry. It was all like a joke. It couldn't even be considered a technique. It was just an instinctive reaction. Frightening origin substance fluctuations resided in her body, transforming into a bright red robe. It was so peaceful that it made people want to fall asleep. Even the sparkling and translucent crystal shoes appeared. Even the illusion of a boundless deep sea appeared, as well as the illusion of a magnificent palace hidden in the depths of the sea. Huaisher was petrified in place. He couldn't believe it. You're almost at the 4th level. There's still a lot to go. Luo Xian casually twirled her hair. Elder Wang of the Outer Path sent a lot of precious materials over, so the speed of my advancement is still okay. However, the cultivation of destiny is still not enough. I estimate that it will take a long time. Huaisher didn't say anything else. He felt a deep pain in his face. He originally thought that his advancement speed was already exaggerated enough. He didn't expect that there would be another example in front of him that made him despair. In less than a year, Luo Xian had once again stepped into the 3rd level of the Path of Paradise. She was even leisurely sprinting towards the 4th level at an astonishing speed. From the moment Luo Xian appeared, the style of the battle became completely different from what he had originally expected. Rather than saying it was a battle, it was more like a one-sided massacre. When this monster-like skill was applied to slaughter, the original script of Spartacus collapsed under the terrifying influence of the mechanical descent. It became a joke. Luo Xian, who no longer held back or showed mercy, began to go all out. She once again displayed a terrifying posture that was above the past. But unlike before, what remained was no longer a bloody scene. Even under the guidance of the Sleeping Beauty's sacred mark, all things fell into a peaceful slumber, ushering in the end of eternity. At the highest point, Pan de Long looked at everything that happened in front of him in astonishment. He finally recovered from his daze and couldn't hold back his anger. Huaisher, are you going to hide behind a woman? There's a saying, look at me. If I don't live off a woman, can I live with my conscience? Huaisher calmly hid behind Luo Xian and entered his role as a lackey. Not only am I going to hide behind a woman, I'm also going to cheer her on. Sister Xian, stab him. Okay. Luo Xian nodded and raised her hand. She didn't take the weapon that Huaisher handed over. She was still barehanded. She just took a deep breath and aimed at Pan de Long's mask from a distance of 2 kilometers. She slowly clenched her fingers and gently punched forward. Pa! The sound of a bubble bursting rang out in the air. Pan de Long's body stiffened, and he staggered back. A tragic crack appeared on the mask on his face. Blood gushed out and immediately dissipated in the air. When he appeared again, he looked a lot more dispirited. He even hid behind layers of defense and didn't show his face again. Once the performance of the Golden Palace began and the actors entered the stage, it was equivalent to becoming a character in the story. They couldn't be immune to the attacks and persecution from other characters. Even if they could be resurrected with the power of the theatrical troupe's sacred mark, they would still feel pain and weakness. But no matter what, it was too outrageous to kill Pan de Long, who was definitely not a hothead, with a single punch from 2 kilometers away. It was as if a long distance had been omitted. Luo Xian's power was transmitted to the enemy without any hindrance. It descended calmly, inflicting violence and destruction. Every technique used and the operating method of the texture were within the scope of Huaishi's knowledge. But once they were combined, it quickly exceeded the scope of Huaishi's understanding. The almost miraculous strike seemed to have integrated into the entire arena and become a part of it. It was as if the destruction was endless. What is the principle behind this? Huaishi felt that his eyeballs were about to fall out. He couldn't understand. It's a trick that I recently figured out. Luo Xian replied, according to the way Father named it. It can be called seamless. The inspiration came from the last time I fought with the Heretic King. Because it hurt a lot, I realized that there is a limit to techniques. You see, if you can't come into contact with the enemy, no matter how profound the technique is, it can't be used. So, I thought for a long time before coming up with this method. Use the medium to transmit your own power. If you want to talk about the feeling, it should be when the air is not paying attention. As long as the loss is reduced to a sufficient extent, then the distance won't be a problem. Speaking of this, Luo Xian sighed with a headache. In theory, it can be done, but such a mess, I'm afraid you can't learn it, right? If you're more confident, you can remove the word right. Huaishi shook his head and smiled bitterly. In this world, other than you, Sister Xian, no one can replicate this kind of thing, right? Luo Xian looked back. Are you praising me? Yes, Huaishi said seriously. It's too powerful. I'm no match for it at all. I'm so happy to be praised by the person I like. Luo Xian smiled happily and didn't hide her feelings at all. She always looked like a mature big sister, but when she was happy, she made people feel like she was a child. It was as if as long as someone praised her clothes, she would be happy the whole morning. I really want to talk to you for a while more, she sighed regretfully, but you should be in a hurry, right? In the silence, Huaishi nodded. Then, let's just flip this lousy stage over. On the white horse, Luo Xian held the reins and looked up at the arena that was immersed in the turmoil. She whispered, "It's time for the messy farce to end, because the real beautiful story has just begun. It's time to say goodbye." She raised her voice and announced in all directions, "The ball is about to end. The bell should be rung." So, in the sudden midnight, a mighty bell rang in the distance. A bright and beautiful pumpkin carriage appeared from the galloping white horse, and a kind and gentle figure appeared from the carriage. The projection of the fairy godmother descended here and reached out to Luo Xian. "It's time to go back, Your Highness." The miracle was about to end. Luo Xian lightly jumped from the horse's back, reached out, and held the hand that came from fate. "Can you close your eyes?" "Huaishi?" A clear voice sounded in Huaishi's ears. "Although there's nothing to hide, I just don't want you to see my ugliest appearance." Huaishi was stunned for a moment, lowered his head, and closed his eyes. So Luo Xian smiled. She turned around and walked into the pumpkin carriage. At that moment, the white horse neighed and stood up. A violent and ferocious aura rose from the pumpkin carriage. Midnight had arrived, and the magic of the miracle had lost its effect. Everything would be beaten back to its original appearance. In the deepest darkness, the ferocious mystic dragon raised his eyes, cast an indifferent glance at the mortal world, opened his mouth, and roared. A solid outline appeared above the pumpkin carriage. The miracle overturned, and the disaster that was formed appeared in front of the troop without any disguise. It was an ugly and violent illusion, a ferocious monster that was the most ferocious in the world. At that moment, the mystic dragon raised his eyes, opened his mouth, and spat out a destructive light at the golden dream in front of him. The time of destruction had arrived. Chapter 5, 95. That was not a power that could be brought about by a miracle. Instead, it was an out-and-out disaster. It was as if the crystallization of the abyss had appeared here. As the demonic dragon's ferocious outline unfolded, a pitch-black torrent swept towards the weak golden dream, engulfing everything and turning everything into ashes. Everything was killed in an instant, but everything was rebuilt in an instant. In the terrifying pain, Harley Quinn gritted his teeth and tried not to let out any whimpers. Isabella was already unable to carry out her self-torture and fainted in the convulsions. But even in shock, the stigmata did not retreat at all. It still turned into a pillar that supported the existence of the golden dream. The high-pitched soprano did not stop. With her soul, everything was rebuilt from the self-destruction so that the story of Spartacus could continue. Pan DeLong clenched his fists tightly and allowed the mask to burn to ashes in the terrifying heat. His broken face looked like a skeleton, but his stooped body was standing straight at this moment. "I won't let you leave this place." "Why, sure." He gritted his teeth and roared with his head raised. "Even old bones won't admit defeat so easily. Don't be delusional." Facing the demonic dragon's surprise attack head-on, under the power of the troop, everything began to be rebuilt at an accelerated speed. Tall buildings rose from the ruins. Everything was rebuilt, turning this dream into a cage, firmly binding them within. And at that moment, a wail of destruction appeared on the shell of the golden dream. Pan DeLong's body suddenly shook, and he spat out his broken internal organs. He looked back with difficulty. Unbelievable. There was a sound of collapse. From the outside, the long escape finally came to an end. With a sudden slash, the cracked truck finally lost control and smashed into the ruins under the tower. From among them, a driver in a sorry state crawled out with difficulty and wanted to get up, but the back of his hand was stepped on by an iron boot. Then, just as he raised his head, he was kicked away. He rolled on the ground in a sorry state. How did Leonard, the son of the Red Dragon, fall to such a state? In front of him, the old Ahura lowered his eyes. He could no longer bear the ugly state of his former disciple's dying struggle. The disciple that he had once placed high hopes on, the heir that he had painstakingly nurtured, the future captain of the Eye of Nightmares, had now become like this. It was just a setback, just a curse. Everything changed beyond recognition. Lose everything. They had even chosen the most extreme betrayal. They had ransacked the treasury of the Eye of Nightmare and stolen the treasures that were supposed to be handed over to the ruler. Eve lit, causing the entire battle group to suffer unprecedented humiliation. It was so disappointing. AI fully walked closer, raised his sword, and pointed it at his heart. "Raymond, do you have anything else to say?" "No more." Raymond sighed. "I really can't think of anything to say to make you let me go. Can you do me a favor on account of my magnanimity and let me fulfill my last wish? I'll go to the Eye of Nightmare to eat, drink, gamble, and have fun. When I come back, I'll go to the Eye of Nightmare to meet my death. How about that?" Of course, it was nothing much. In that instant, the blade pierced through Raymond's chest. There was no longer any warmth. But then, black blood spurted out from it. There were also rotten and deformed internal organs, as well as countless wisps of dark aura. It was as if he had broken the jar that held the calamity. The corruption within flowed out. It revealed a ferocious and ugly appearance. It was impossible to imagine that that was the shape of human internal organs. Tumors, deformities, and countless tiny vicious eyes flowing in them. Under the seemingly healthy and ordinary appearance, the inside had already been degenerated to an unimaginable extent. The terrifying curse that penetrated deep into his bones was lodged in it, causing him to fall to the bottom of the abyss. The blood and water that was almost blasphemous was eroding the land of hell, causing the air to become highly toxic and smelly. It also stunned AI fully on the spot. He was stunned. Unbelievable. At that moment, broken chains suddenly rose from the ruins and wrapped around AI Fully's body, binding him in an instant. He could not move. This was a trap set by a scheming person. After a long period of preparation, this moment had finally arrived. "I'm sorry, teacher. I scared you." On the ground, Raymond helplessly reached out his hand and held up his deformed internal organs. He wanted to put them back into his body, but those internal organs seemed to have their own will and squirmed, not listening to his control at all. "It's very difficult to live on, teacher." He gave up on his actions in frustration. "You see, every month, changing internal organs is a huge expense. Where's the stone heart?" AI Fully's eyes widened, and he roared angrily in the shackles. "Answer me, Leonard, where did the stone heart that you stole go?" "This is really a long story." Raymond showed a self-deprecating smile. Behind him, there was a sudden roar. It was the earth and rocks rising in the ruins, and there were countless sounds of steel rubbing against each other. It was as if an incredible miracle had appeared in the dying bones, transforming into a form beyond imagination, just like what you know, teacher. Raymond looked into his teacher's eyes and told him, "Cursed by the element of destruction, even with the stone heart, only one of me and my dragon could live. So, I was thinking, since it was going to die anyway, why couldn't the one who died be me?" That man said calmly. "So I saved it." In the low voice, the ruined Dragon Rider truck that was originally riddled with holes suddenly fell apart. But under the truck frame, the hidden huge alloy skeleton and countless huge instruments that looked like internal organs closed with a bang, bursting with dazzling electric light. It was just like rebirth. The wings made of alloy spread out, and the scorching sun-like light shone from its eyes. From the dust that filled the sky, the red dragon that had already died once again revealed its huge outline from hell with the help of steel. "I'll King kill you, old thing." The voice that had been residing in the flail in the past sounded again, its mouth fragrant. "Are you surprised? Are you surprised?" The dust was blown away by the storm. After getting rid of the cumbersome truck shell, the newly born steel dragon grinned and cast a huge shadow that covered the sky. After combining the remains of the red dragon and the stone heart of the abyss, more than 6 Ivory Tower project teams spent 4 project cycles around it, using the most extravagant methods and the most cutting-edge technology to finally recreate it, named after the legendary chariot that humans offered to the god of sky and thunder. The real Gordium reappeared here. Chariot of Fate, mechanical god summoning. Now in front of the huge mechanical dragon's chest, layers of armor unfolded, revealing the huge weapon buried deep in the shell and the sun of origin that was lit up after all the origin substances were poured in. "Teacher, this time I won." A blazing stream of light gushed out. Victory and defeat had been decided if it wasn't for the fact that the cannon body wasn't facing Iverson at all, but rather the huge tower behind him. In an instant, a dazzling stream of light whizzed out, penetrating the sky of the Village of Dusk from bottom to top. It penetrated into the center of the tower. It tore apart the golden dream that shrouded there, violently digging out a fatal gap. It cut off the foundation that the Golden Palace relied on from the outside. This was the last straw that broke the camel's back. Then, in the cracked theater, a violent silhouette rose, spreading destruction, descending to end, revealing a deep brilliance that stung the eyes. Disaster breaking out of the cage. Raymond was stunned in place. After a long time, he couldn't help but laugh at himself. Even putting out a fire can't keep up with the heat. 40 to 60 is probably referring to me, right? A shattering sound came from Iverson's body. The shackles were broken. Azura walked out of the fragments unscathed, but after using up all the origin substances, the Chariot of Fate also fell into hibernation, unable to move. It no longer had the power to fight back. But the old man's face was hideous and terrifying. He was so angry. "What are you doing, Leonard?" Iverson held the heavy sword and stepped forward, angrily questioning, "Are you pitying me? Or am I so old that I can't be your opponent?" "I'm just working, teacher," Raymond replied calmly. "I'm just carrying out my duty." For a mercenary, it's not something difficult to understand, right? When necessary. Even if you have to give up your life, you have to complete the employer's mission. Isn't this the principle that the Eye of Nightmare is proud of? Traitor, don't talk about the Eye of Nightmare's principle. Leonard, Iverson retorted indifferently. Who can you fool with such an excuse? I just want to do something meaningful, that's all. Leonard raised his eyes and looked behind Iverson. Besides, under the premise that their lives are not in danger, who wouldn't like to make more money? There, the sound of heavy footsteps could be heard. Forster, the chief engineer from the Iron Crystal constellation, revealed his existence. He held an ancient double-barreled shotgun in his hand and looked down from above. "Mr. Iverson, can you move the sword away from our driver's neck?" the old man with stubble on his face asked. "Although I don't know how Raymond offended you, the Eye of Nightmare shouldn't do anything against your employer's orders, right?" He emphasized the pronunciation of Raymond's name. A faint, killing intent flowed out of the pitch-black barrel. "You're so slow, Chief Engineer." Raymond finally heaved a sigh of relief and could not help but complain. "I almost died. Even if you don't care about my life, you have to care about the loan I owe you, right? I should have been able to come earlier, but I was knocked out by a cup of tea from some old bastard. I had no choice." Forster scratched his messy hair with a helpless expression, but his eyes were fixed on Iverson. Iverson did not move. He just stared at the student in front of him. "You've become weak, Raymond," he said coldly. "Placing your life on someone else's rescue is too unwise. You could have killed me." "Spare me, teacher." Raymond sighed. "I haven't done murder and arson for a long time. Why should I force a piece of trash who doesn't have much time left to do such a cruel thing, even if I'll kill you here?" When he asked this, Iverson's expression did not change. He did not care that his vital parts were exposed in front of the chief engineer. "Then there's nothing I can do." Raymond laughed self-deprecatingly. "If it was in the past, I might have done so, but people have to grow, right? Why should a person who can die at any time care about where he dies? 5 years ago, when I was about to die, I realized that I had nothing in my life other than following orders and killing and arson. So I thought, at least before I die, I should do something meaningful, do something right." He raised his eyes and told such a teacher, "In that case, it won't be a pity to die." In the long silence, Azura stared at his student. He felt as if he was looking at an idiot. His disappointment was indescribable. "It's too stupid and ridiculous." He asked with pity, "Leonard, do people like you also yearn for salvation?" "In fact, I'm not that stupid." Raymond shrugged awkwardly. "But there's no rule that says we can't find the meaning of life, right?" In the silence, the hovering blade slowly lifted. Iverson took a step back. He was still expressionless. It was hard to tell whether he was mocking or despising. He just glanced at the student in front of him indifferently and finally told him, "Then enjoy the last of your stupid life, because there's not much left." That was how he said goodbye. Iverson turned and left. When the teacher's figure disappeared at the end of the line of sight, Raymond finally lost the strength to support his body and fell on his back. Severe dizziness hit him. In a trance, he vaguely saw the flash on the tower in the distance. He couldn't help but chuckle softly. "Come on, long-haired big brother. My loan depends on you." He carried the bet voucher exchanged with all his savings. Raymond fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 5, 96. When Weisher opened his eyes, he saw the golden dream gradually shattering in the collapse in front of him. The Colosseum had disappeared. Instead, there were broken stands and a stage that was gradually collapsing. The outline of the tower was gradually emerging, and everything illusory was disappearing. Long hair flew in the wind in front of his eyes, bringing with it a fresh breath. It was Luo Xian. She sat beside Weisher, staring at the scene outside the tower. She tucked her messy hair behind her ears and smiled at Weisher when she turned back. "The story that doesn't belong to you has come to an end, Weisher." She asked softly, "Are you going to move forward alone again?" "I'm sorry." Weisher nodded, not daring to look at her. "Because someone is calling, right?" Luo Xian tilted her head and looked at him, seeming to sigh. "As long as someone is calling for help, there is no way to ignore it. You are such a troublesome person, I know. Although I always feel that you are a scumbag. I still hope that more people can see your handsome face." Weisher smiled reluctantly. He wanted to say something, but his expression became stiff. After a short silence, he gradually lowered his head, unable to face such hopeful eyes. "I'm sorry, Sister Xian. This time, I can't save them anymore. Isn't this normal? No one can do everything. There is always a limit." Luo Xian's smile remained unchanged. She reached out and pinched his face hard, as if to encourage him. "But there should be something you can do, right?" She said, "Something you should do." Being stared at by that pair of soft eyes, Weisher was stunned. After a long time, he slowly nodded, "Yes." Then her smile became more and more gentle. "Then go, Weisher." Luo Xian reached out and hugged him again, so gently. "You should go. Go to where you should go. Don't stop and don't look back. If you feel pain, just shout out loud. If you feel sad, it's okay to cry like a child. If you encounter an insurmountable obstacle, just call out to me again." She stared into Weisher's eyes, so close, and solemnly told him, "In that case, no matter where I am, I will definitely come to your side." She generously offered her only gentleness and tolerance. Luo Xian smiled, looking so handsome. "Just like you saved me, I will definitely come to save you, Weisher, no matter how far away we are." Weisher couldn't help but sigh. He couldn't resist such tenderness. "Be a little strict once in a while, Sister Xian." He felt that if this continued, he would degenerate into a cripple at the speed of light. Like a spoiled child, he would become more and more unreasonable. "Because you're too harsh on yourself, right?" Luo Xian smiled and let go of his hand. She took a step back. "Go, Weisher. Go. I'll watch over you." Being looked at like that, inexplicably, Weisher's chest surged with courage and determination that even surprised himself. It allowed him to face all of this calmly. He left with a smile. "Goodbye, Sister Xian." Weisher said goodbye softly. "I'm leaving." He slowly retreated, turned around, and set off toward the top of the tower again. He began the final climb and never looked back. Come on, Luo Xian smiled and stared at his back as he left. Gradually, along with the final stage, it dissipated into nothingness. It disappeared. Under the clouds in the sky, under the illumination of the glow, the battle and collision between the two finally came to an end. Enveloped by the halo, Atlas quietly stared at everything on the ground. He only coldly defended against the attacks from the underworld of the alien realm and did not even fight back. Finally, Michelle flew into a rage. "Are you looking down on me, Mikhail?" The old man on the altar roared. "How dare you be distracted in front of me?" Furious lightning gathered in the rain clouds. The power of the rain god traveled in this hell, setting off wild waves in the void. It instantly penetrated the light screen that enveloped the giant and left deep cracks on Astra's body. Countless rays of light flew out like blood and dissipated into the air. Astra, who was deep in thought, finally raised his head and looked at the enemy in front of him. "Do you want to win against me so badly, Michelle?" "Is it wrong to want to win?" Michelle asked coldly. "Is there anyone who is willing to accept a life full of failure? Mikhail, you can mock me, but your mockery will not work." "No, it's not. In fact, I deeply respect you and the will you have shown up until now." Uncharacteristically, the Grandmaster did not mock and ridicule him, nor did he coldly criticize him from above. He was still calm and collected as he expressed his admiration for the enemy in front of him. "You made me feel that maybe my previous contempt was a mistake. Unfortunately, I will not correct this. The gap between you and me is not something that can be closed with hard work and passion." The Grandmaster said, "You should be well aware of this, Michelle. Sometimes one should accept reality and accept one's powerlessness. If I say this, you might think that I am talking nonsense from above, so I won't mention it again. If you want to fight and decide the winner with me, I can satisfy you. Michelle, as long as you challenge me, I will definitely respond, no matter how many times. But before that, I have a question." From afar, the Grandmaster on the bridge with his arms crossed asked, "If you win and obtain this hell, no, I should say that you represent the Ivy League and the American lineage. What will you do?" "Stupid question." Michelle sneered, but did not hide his purpose. "Of course, we will do what we do in every hell. Explore, develop, dismantle, control, and use. Even the Astronomy Society cannot make us give up this power. Mikhail, one day we will do what the Ivory Tower cannot do. We will completely dismantle this power, devour it, and turn it into a weight on the other side of the lever. We will lift it up thousands of times. Is that so? As expected of the cradle of the American Capital Alliance. You are always so calculating." The Grandmaster sighed. "I don't doubt what you said. I believe that the American lineage, and you have the ability and time to do this." After a short pause, he suddenly asked, "But Michelle, do you know why I have always looked down on you?" "Don't say it as if there is anything in this world that an egomaniac like you can look up to." Michelle sneered. "I knew it 30 years ago, Mikhail. The reason why you look so reclusive is not because of some bullsh Astra's T autism, but because you think that everyone except you is an idiot. Do you look up to anyone, Mikhail?" "Indeed, I don't. But the reasons for discrimination are different." The Grandmaster replied frankly, "Sometimes I look down on many people because they are too stupid. But only you, Michelle. What I hate the most is that you are always so smart." "No, it's more appropriate to say that he's shrewd. You always know when to advance and when to retreat. You know how to analyze the pros and cons. You know that you will get the most reward with the least effort. Back then, everyone thought that you were the most outstanding student under the teacher. Even you thought so. That is why you hate me so much, because everything I have shown is far inferior to you. But in the end, I can always surpass you. You are talking about this bullsh asterisk T again." Michelle suppressed his anger and questioned coldly, "When you are high and mighty, you naturally have the ability to judge everything. But you are not the only reason in this world. When are you going to stop denying others?" "Perhaps my view is biased and wrong, but I will not change it. At least, there is one thing that I am sure of. The Grand Master gave a conclusion. In your view, everything can be quantified. Perhaps to ordinary people, such a viewpoint is not wrong, but when people are bound by such a viewpoint, they will no longer be able to reach the pinnacle of alchemy. This is where you have failed the most. Michel, when will you understand? Under the halo, the dome giant raised his eyes and declared proudly, "A miracle is a miracle because it is not bound by common sense and cannot be measured by numbers. When you pray, it will respond. When you are in pain, it will come. When the end comes, despair will end. When everything comes to an end and everything returns to nothingness in an orderly manner, this peaceful result is the true embodiment of a miracle. Look carefully, Michel. Today, let me give you the last lesson that your teacher lacked." The dome giant raised his palm and pointed it at the shrouded hell below. Everything was immersed in beauty and sorrow in the land of dusk. Endless source of substance gathered in the halo above Atlas' head. They collided with each other and turned into violent thunder. Countless small miracles collided with each other, causing a roar and building the prototype of a huge secret instrument. It was an enormous silhouette that had engulfed the entire hell at some point in time. Just like the alchemy cauldron, it continuously extracted the precipitate and source of substance in hell, turning into an illusory fire that enveloped everything. It engulfed everything that seemed beautiful. The operation of the perpetual core stopped abruptly. The kingdom of heaven was no more. Everything in front of him had to be corrected from the root. Mikhail. On the altar of the Great Pyramid, Michel roared angrily, "What are you doing? Are you going to violate the agreement between us?" "I'm doing the right thing." The voice of the Grand Master came. "I'm sorry to violate the agreement between the Ivory Tower and the Ivy League. You can treat it as me cheating. You've won this battle, but I won't stop what I'm going to do." Enough. On the altar, Michel vomited blood and looked up angrily. The Great Pyramid rose angrily, scattering thunder. Like a war chariot full of destruction, it brazenly crashed into the dome giant that was close at hand. "What the F*CK are you going to do to my spoils of war?" Do I still need to answer? The Grand Master laughed. Carrying the huge secret instrument on his back, the dome giant raised his head. Divine light shot out from his eyes, and a majestic voice resounded between heaven and earth. "Why, sure, you tell him, in the face of everything in front of him, as the guardian who cherishes life the most, as the guide of all growth, young arbiter of life, what should you do? Kill, destroy, and destroy." In the final climb, in the battle, on the road paved with blood and corpses, Huaishur held the blade in his hand, calmly answered, and walked towards the end step by step. This was the only answer. Annihilate everything. Are you F*King crazy? Michel's eyes widened, and he could no longer contain his anger and grief. Do you know how precious it is? What are you thinking in your head? Are you pitying a group of dead people, a group of self-inflicted, assimilated phenomenon that has long been assimilated by hell? Even if you're a clean freak, it shouldn't be to such a ridiculous extent. Do you know how much correction value this kind of power can create for us in the present realm? How many living people can be saved because of this? Huaishur, why are you so stubborn? In the pool of blood, the young man who was walking forward silently paused his steps and looked up at the sky, as if he didn't understand why someone would ask such a simple question. "Why?" he said. "Because someone is crying, because I heard it." The silence was sudden. In the sky, amidst the raging Trolocan, Michel widened his eyes in shock. He couldn't believe it. Such a simple reason. In this silence, there was suddenly a sharp laughter. It was so crazy, as if he was laughing so hard that he was holding his stomach and couldn't straighten his back. He was overjoyed. Ha, 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 ha. Can you see it, Michelle? This is the decisive difference between the American genealogy and the celestial genealogy. No, the decisive difference between a merchant and a hero. Holding the projection of Les Miserables in his hand, the Grand Master laughed and announced, "The path of salvation is within." Chapter 597. By the time the last corpse fell into a pool of blood, there was no one left to block Huaisher's path. He stepped onto the last step that had been dyed red. Huaisher finally arrived at the top of the tall tower, facing a gust of wind. Within the gust of wind, he saw a solemn and sacred hall, a large plaza in front of him, and a young girl who had been waiting for him for a long time. Her long golden hair fluttered in the air like a burning flame. She propped herself up with her stone sword and stared at Huaisher, who had come from afar. In the sky above her head, a huge sun that did not belong to this place was burning vigorously. With the bronze ring carved with countless patterns as the carrier, the projection of the first sun, Tezcatlipoca, appeared here, burning violently and shrouding the entire square. At this moment, she was not wearing armor, and she did not have the youthful and modern aura of the past. She wore a sacred robe and a jewel-studded crown. Her exposed face and arms were covered with blood-red inscriptions and totems. This was the shadow of the smoke mirror on the ground, the representative of the first sun, Tezcatlipoca's high priest. Liz Hetmock was here. She was fully armed and waiting for her enemy. "Have you prepared how to defeat me?" She raised her eyes and stared at Huaisher, whose upper body was dyed red with blood. "Not yet." Huaisher sighed and lowered his head, looking at the wounds on his chest and arms, as well as the metal scars that had formed after the silver blood medicine had healed. He could no longer be considered to be in peak condition. He could be said to be an arrow at the end of its flight. Against Liz, the future leader of the American faction, who was armed to the teeth and had the geographical advantage, he did not have much confidence. Even if they were at the same level, her skill and experience were not inferior to his, not to mention the countless border relics on her body. As for the bronze sun that enveloped the entire plaza, just by sensing the tyrannical origin substance and divine might that constantly surged out, it was possible to understand how terrifying the power hidden within was. "Actually, I don't have much strength left. Even though I can still hold on, I have less than a third of my origin substance left." Huaisher sincerely asked, "So, can you please make a little convenience here and let me go?" Liz looked at him, her face expressionless. He was not angered by such shameless words. Or perhaps he already knew that his opponent never had the self-awareness of a warrior. "I'm sorry, Huaisher. Work is work." She propped her hand on the stone sword and replied indifferently, "Moreover, other than work, there are also personal grudges." "I really have no way to refute that." Huaisher smiled bitterly. "Believe me, I have also suffered greatly in various ways. Are you regretting it?" "I regret it very much." Huaisher nodded sincerely. "Do you need me to apologize?" "Repentance won't help, but I still want to repent." Huaisher scratched his head and looked at the woman in front of him awkwardly. He said tentatively, "I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? I feel like we can get along quite well. If there's a chance, we can definitely become good friends." Liz didn't reply. Instead, the stone sword in her hand twisted slightly. Sparks flew from the friction between metal and stone, and the sharp stone teeth were already aimed at Huaisher's throat. She was ready to attack. Repentance wouldn't help. Even if Huaisher knelt here and offered his body to the skinning god to atone for his sins, it wouldn't change Liz's mind. As such, there was no need to waste any more words. She didn't want to hear any more. In the dead silence, Huaishi's expression gradually stiffened. After a long time, he sighed helplessly. As the representative of the gods on the ground, are you really going to remain indifferent to the cries of so many people? The smoke mirror is not a benevolent god. Don't be mistaken. Huaishi. Liz sneered. In the first era, once the people on the ground began to waver in front of hell, the sun would fall. Tazcatrapoca turned into a leopard and killed everyone in the world. One of its names is Nekakyatl, which means enemies of all sides. Those who don't believe in it can't be saved, and those who believe in it can't live. The wind of impermanence never cares for the human world, let alone hell. She said indifferently, God will not pity this place. But as Huaishi took a step forward and asked again, Liz Hetmach, as a ascender and a benevolent human, do you really not have any mercy in your heart? No. Liz raised the stone sword coldly and said word by word, So, Huaishi, please don't talk nonsense. If you want to go through here, it's very simple. There's only one way, and that is to kill me. Or let me kill you. I'll personally send you to the underworld. Okay. The last gentleness in Huaishi's eyes slowly dissipated, and he gradually became serious. Then, as you wish, Liz Hetmach. He raised the sword of virtue in his hand, but the blade quickly collapsed and disappeared without a trace. He took the first step forward. He met her cold and solemn gaze. Liz, you're indeed an opponent that I can't defeat if I don't go all out. But even if I defeat you, I'm afraid I don't have any strength left. I have to save this strength to do more important things. So I'll give you the choice. Once again, he took a step forward. Under the light of the sun, he walked barehanded toward the girl who blocked his way step by step. I'll go through here, but I won't fight with you. Huaishi looked into her eyes and told her seriously, If you think what I'm doing is meaningless, then kill me here. I won't resist. The first step, the second step, and then the third step, stepping into the frenzy of killing intent and letting the premonition of death engulf him, Huaishi calmly stared at Liz and calmly accepted the anger and hatred. Forward, step by step, without any hesitation. You're really unrepentant. Huaishi. In the silence, Liz's eyes became colder and colder. How stupid it is to place your victory and defeat on someone else's pity. Sorry, I have no other choice. Huaishi calmly moved forward. But Liz, you still have. Now, there's a chance in front of you. You can choose to save them, like me, or let them fall into the abyss and build your heaven on top of wailing and hell. For a moment, Liz seemed to be shaken, but soon her eyes became as hard as iron. There was no longer any weakness or wavering, only coldness. This is hell. Huaishi. How can mercy be found in this place? She softly muttered, spitting out her last bit of pity. This place is already incurable, just like you. You have to accept reality. In that moment, the stone-toothed sword trembled violently and let out a roar. The panther spirit's soul rose from within, accompanied by Liz's origin substance. It flowed into the secret instrument, causing endless smoke to rise towards the bronze sun in the sky. The ever-changing wind, please bestow disaster upon us. Liz raised her head and declared to the world in front of her, the light of the human world has fallen here, and eternal darkness has been born in the night. As a result, the endless flames seemed to become corporeal and fell from the sun. Countless strands gathered and wrapped around the stone-toothed sword. It caused the ancient sword blade to burn red in an instant. It sizzled in Liz's hands. The premonition of death invaded Huaishi's heart like never before, causing his soul to tremble as he sensed the divine might in the sky. Without a doubt, this was a remnant of a god, the reflection of a miracle on the ground. When the tyrannical flames dissipated, the bronze sun in the sky revealed a solemn mirror made of obsidian. The mirror was eternally pitch black, as if it reflected the end and future of this world. However, in that darkness, a solemn outline appeared. A huge and withered skeleton sat upright in the sun. It was deathly silent and desolate, as if it had long died with the old world. But now, under Liz's call, a dark green flame ignited in the pitch-black eye sockets. A wisp of scarlet red condensed, just like the last glimmer of light at the end of dusk. It fell from the fingers in front of its knees. The blood light fell on the cracked blade, causing the stone-toothed sword to emit a mournful cry and tremble violently, unable to bear the burden. It revealed endless tyrannical ferocity. "Receive the bitter fruit." "Why, sure," Liz angrily said. "This is the last afterglow you will ever see." In that instant, the stone-toothed sword slashed down. It aimed at Why Sure, who was just inches away. The world was dark. The bronze sun shattered with a bang. Endless power was entrusted to this sword, causing all things to be drowned in death. Miracle imprint, the first cause of death. This was a replay of the end of the First Era. Tazkatlipoca extinguished himself and indulged in tyranny, causing the afterimage of the destruction of the era to be entrusted to this sword, turning into a dim light that completely destroyed everything. This was the last mercy he left for the mortal world. Before the endless darkness arrived, the last ray of the sun's afterglow. And it was at that moment that Liz's eyes reflected the young man who walked forward alone and calmly welcomed death. And the dark tide that followed behind him. Unbelievable. It was the illusion of the past that followed salvation. And it was also the perfect remnant that had once ushered in salvation. Countless figures gathered in one place like a long march with no end in sight and no boundary in sight. It was as if they covered the sky and earth, forming a huge scale that swallowed the entire world. They came from different places, different species, and even different eras. Those souls that yearned for salvation followed the lonely figure. When he walked forward alone, he didn't know that tens of millions of people were following him. In the fleeting afterglow, those strange and familiar faces appeared in front of Liz's eyes, making her widen her eyes in disbelief. In those completely different groups, there was a vague illusion of déjà vu. It was the uniform of the Ivy League, those who died in this battle, the patients who were seriously injured and unconscious, and the poor souls who lost themselves in the assimilation of hell. But now, those silhouettes that should have settled in the deepest part of hell stood behind Why Sure. They stood in front of Liz. They quietly watched her, along with tens of millions of people, walk toward the destruction bestowed by God in front of them. "You bunch of idiots." Liz lowered her eyes sadly, and the sword slashed down. You're tuning into the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.